He built the weapon that could end the world, and the thing that finally destroyed him was never the government, never the Soviets, never even the bomb itself. It was a flaw he carried into every room he ever walked into. Christopher Nolan's 2023 film Oppenheimer spends 3 hours convincing you the villain of this story is Lewis Strauss, a bitter bureaucrat with a grudge. He is not. The real villain has been on screen since the very first frame, wearing Cillian Murphy's face, and almost nobody watching has named him correctly. By the end of this video, you will see exactly where the film hides the evidence, in 3 separate moments, long before the security hearing ever begins. This video is an independent, transformative work created for review, criticism, commentary, educational, informational, and entertainment purposes. Any third-party content is used only to support original analysis and is not intended to replace or reproduce the original work. Before there was a bomb, there was a boy who could not stand to be second. Robert Oppenheimer arrives at Cambridge in the 1920s as a prodigy who has never once had to sit with failure, and the film wastes no time showing us what happens when that boy finally does. He is clumsy in a laboratory built for careful hands, publicly humiliated by a professor named Patrick Blackett, who treats him like a nuisance rather than a genius. And for the first time in his life, Robert Oppenheimer discovers that being the smartest person in a room does not guarantee that the room will love him back. Nolan shoots these early scenes tight and unstable, the camera pressing close to Murphy's face while the soundtrack hums at a frequency just below comfortable, and that choice matters more than it looks. This is not a director simply establishing a setting. This is a director building the interior architecture of a mind that will later split an atom, one uncomfortable, overtuned frame at a time. What Oppenheimer does next is the single most important character beat in the entire film, and almost every review skips past it in a single sentence. He poisons an apple and leaves it on Blackett's desk, not because he actually wants his professor dead. He wants control. He wants the humiliation to stop belonging to him and start belonging to someone else, even for a moment, even through an act so reckless it nearly ends his academic career before it begins. Notice what the film does not show you here. Guilt. Real, sustained, sit with it guilt. Oppenheimer is quietly walked back from the incident by family intervention and a hastily arranged psychiatric consultation, and then the film simply moves on, because Oppenheimer moves on. He does not sit with what he almost did. He buries it beneath ambition and reinvents himself somewhere else. And that pattern, bury the damage, relocate, rebuild the myth, is not a one-time reaction to a bad year at Cambridge. It is the operating system of the entire character, and you will watch him run it again and again for the rest of his life, in a marriage, in a laboratory, and eventually in a desert in New Mexico. This is the first plan of a loop that will not close until the final act, so hold on to it. A man who cannot tolerate being diminished, who would rather destroy something than sit inside his own smallness. Keep that description in your head, because in a few hours of screen time, that description will no longer be about a professor and a piece of fruit. It will be about the entire human race, and the film wants you to have already met this exact impulse, in miniature, harmless, forgivable, before it reappears wearing the shape of a mushroom cloud. There is a craft decision buried in this sequence that most viewers absorb without ever consciously registering it. Long before Trinity, long before Los Alamos, Nolan is already threading in the sound design that will define the entire film. Low tremors, imagined footfalls, a rumble sitting just beneath the dialogue like a held breath. At Cambridge, that rumble plays under a boy's private humiliation. Later, the exact same sonic language will play under the fate of two cities. That is not an accident of scoring. That is a director telling you, structurally, at the level of sound rather than plot, that the emotional register of personal wounded pride and the emotional register of civilizational catastrophe are, in this film, the same register, only scaled up. Ask yourself honestly, did you clock the poisoned apple as a genuine character flaw, or file it away as a quirky footnote on the road to genius? The kind of thing biopics always include to make a subject feel human before making them heroic. Most first-time viewers do the second, and that is precisely the trap being set. A director less interested in psychology could have cut this sequence and lost nothing from the plot. But the argument the film is quietly building about who this man actually is beneath the myth does not survive without it, which is the difference between a script that merely recounts a life and one engineered to indict it. Cambridge cannot hold him, so he leaves for Göttingen, and this is where the film quietly performs one of its smartest pieces of visual storytelling without ever announcing it as such. In Germany, Oppenheimer is finally surrounded by minds operating at his speed, Niels Bohr's ideas rippling through the room like weather, and for the first time Nolan lets the camera slow down around him. He is not fidgeting. He is not spiraling. He is, briefly, genuinely at peace, because he has found found the one thing that has eluded him since childhood, an environment where his brilliance is not a threat to anyone, only a contribution. It does not last, because it is not built to last. Oppenheimer returns to Berkeley, and the moment he steps back into American academic life, we watch him rebuild the myth from Cambridge in miniature, this time with an audience of his own choosing. He does not simply teach quantum mechanics. He performs it, pacing, chain-smoking, dropping ideas half a beat faster than the room can catch them. Students who cannot follow him fast enough are swept aside by the sheer velocity of the lecture, and the ones who can keep up become something closer to disciples than students, trailing him between buildings, absorbing not just physics, but his posture, his cadence, the way he holds a cigarette like punctuation. This is not incidental character texture, and if you only clock it as a montage of academic charm, you are missing what the film is actually building. Oppenheimer does not build colleagues here. He builds believers, and believers do not challenge you. They follow you, and a man who is only ever followed never learns to hear the word no. Compare this to how Nolan shot the Cambridge sequence just minutes earlier. Claustrophobic, hostile, a room that refused to affirm him. Berkeley is the exact inverse, expansive, warm, worshipful, and the contrast is the point. Given the choice between a room that challenges him and a room that adores him, Oppenheimer chooses adoration every time, and the film is quietly asking you to notice that this is a choice, not a circumstance. Watch how many times across the rest of the story someone tries to warn him about security risks, about political optics, about the cost of his own arrogance, and watch how consistently he treats the warning as an inconvenience rather than information worth acting on. That pattern starts here, in a Berkeley lecture hall, dressed up as charisma, applauded as brilliance. It will not look like charisma by the time the story is finished with him. It helps to compare this to how most biopics handle genius on screen, because the contrast tells you exactly what Nolan is choosing not to do. The usual playbook is a montage, equations flooding a chalkboard, a swelling score, a single moment of visionary insight rendered almost mystically, the audience told, through spectacle, that this person sees something the rest of us cannot. Nolan refuses that shortcut almost entirely in the Berkeley sequence. Instead of showing us the physics as magic, he shows us the room, the social mechanics of a genius accumulating followers. Because the film's real subject was never quantum theory, it was always power, and how effortlessly intellectual power converts into personal loyalty when nobody in the room is equipped to push back. This is also where the film's structural gamble starts paying dividends, because the script, reportedly written substantially in the first person to keep us locked inside Oppenheimer's own subjective experience, means we are watching his own self-mythology take shape in real time, filtered through his own flattering memory of how brilliant, how sought after, how central he was. We are not being given an objective account of a great teacher. We are being given one man's memory of his own greatness, and a careful viewer should already be asking how reliable that memory is going to turn out to be by the time the story reaches a hearing room designed specifically to interrogate it. Berkeley in the 1930s is not just a physics department. It is a political education, and the film moves Oppenheimer through left-wing fundraisers, Spanish Civil War relief meetings, and the orbit of committed communists with a specific intention. It wants you to see how easily conviction and vanity can look identical from the outside, especially to a man who has never had to distinguish between the two. His brother Frank has joined the Communist Party outright. His close friend Håkon Chevalier moves comfortably inside that world, offering an easy camaraderie Oppenheimer clearly craves. And into this circle walks Jean Tatlock, a psychiatry student and true believer whose politics are not a costume. They are a conviction she has actually paid a price for, in ways the film lets us feel even when it will not spell them out. Their relationship is where the movie's harshest character judgment of Oppenheimer quietly begins, and it has almost nothing to do with infidelity. Notice what he actually offers her. Not partnership, not consistency. He offers presence exactly when it is convenient for him, disappearing for weeks and reappearing when he needs to feel wanted, and Florence Pugh plays every one of those reappearances with the exhausted recognition of someone who has learned precisely what she is being used for and shows up anyway, because some part of her still hopes this time will be different. Some critics have called Tatlock underwritten, and there is a fair argument buried inside that complaint, but it misses the sharper reading available if you watch closely. The film is not failing to develop her. It is showing you a woman being actively underdeveloped by the man standing in front of her, because Oppenheimer only ever has the bandwidth to fully see himself. Every conversation with Tatlock circles back, eventually, to what he needs, what he is building toward, what he cannot yet name, even when she is the one who is unraveling in front of him. She asks him, more than once, in different words and different tones, to actually be present, fully, without an escape route already planned. hand, and he cannot do it, not because he does not love her, but because presence requires a kind of stillness that a man addicted to being extraordinary has never once learned to sit inside. This is the second plan of the loop. A man who cannot stay still long enough to truly witness another person's need, even when that person is drowning in front of him. Remember that failure, because it is about to happen again, on a far larger and far more permanent stage, with consequences that will not stay contained to a single relationship. It is worth addressing the Chevalier friendship directly here, rather than waiting for it to resurface later as a plot device, because the film plants it early for a reason. Chevalier will later approach Oppenheimer with a request to pass information to the Soviets, a request Oppenheimer refuses but does not immediately report, a hesitation that will follow him for the rest of his career. Notice what that hesitation actually is. It is not ideological sympathy. It is loyalty to the feeling of being trusted, being confided in, being the person someone comes to with a dangerous secret, the same hunger that made a lecture hall full of students feel like devotion rather than education. The film is quietly rhyming Chevalier's confidence with Tatlock's need, showing you the same character weakness expressed twice, once romantically and once politically, before either one has cost him anything serious. As for the broader complaint that Nolan cannot write women, the fairer version of that critique is not that Tatlock lacks interiority. It is that the film is uninterested in granting the audience access to any interiority the protagonist himself was too self-absorbed to notice while he was alive inside it. That is a defensible authorial choice, even if it is an uncomfortable one, and it is worth separating a genuine screenwriting limitation from a deliberate narrative restriction dressed up to look like one. Kitty Puning enters the story already married to someone else, already sharper than almost anyone Oppenheimer has met, and the film gives Emily Blunt one advantage that it consistently withholds from Florence Pugh. It lets Kitty be right. Repeatedly, specifically, provably right, and largely ignored anyway. From nearly the moment she appears, Kitty reads situations with a clarity Oppenheimer himself does not possess, sizing up political risk, sizing up the people circling her husband, understanding exactly what kind of danger his naivety represents long before he is willing to admit any danger exists at all. This is not a small detail. It is a thesis statement disguised as a marriage. A tactically superior mind exists inside this story the entire time, fully available to the protagonist, sitting across the breakfast table from him every single morning, and he does not use it, because using it would require treating his wife as an equal collaborator rather than a domestic fixture managing the background hum of his genius. Their courtship overlaps, uncomfortably, with the tail end of his relationship with Tatlock, and the film does not soften this timeline for the audience's comfort, does not give either woman the dignity of a clean separation from the other. Kitty gets pregnant while still married to her previous husband. The divorce is fast, the marriage to Oppenheimer faster, and almost immediately the pattern that will define their entire relationship locks into place. Kitty absorbing the domestic and reputational fallout of decisions Robert makes unilaterally, decisions she frequently would have made differently had he simply asked her first. Watch how often, across the rest of the film, Kitty is proven correct only after the damage has already landed, her warning arriving just early enough for the audience to register it, and just late enough for Robert to have already ignored it. Hold on to that observation, because it becomes one of the most devastating threads running through the entire back half of this story, culminating in a hearing room where the person forced to clean up the wreckage of Robert Oppenheimer's blind spots is, once again, exactly the person who warned him about them years earlier, sitting in a corridor, waiting to be allowed to defend a man who never once let her lead. Watch the dinner party sequences closely, and you will find the film's clearest visual thesis on this marriage. Kitty, drinking too much, isolated among wives who talk about recipes and furniture while she is capable of debating politics and physics at the same table Robert occupies, is not a woman drowning in domesticity by accident. She is a woman deliberately shelved by a husband who benefits from her staying in that seat. This is a meaningful subversion of the standard genius neglects his wife biopic template, where the wife is typically written as simply less capable, a patient saint waiting at home. Kitty is never once written as less capable. She is written as capable and unused, which is a crueler and far more specific kind of neglect, because it cannot be excused as an honest gap in ability. It can only be explained by a husband unwilling to share the room. There is a later moment, small and easy to miss, where Kitty confronts her own drinking with a rare flash of self-awareness, naming it almost as a symptom rather than a habit, and the film lets that admission pass without comment from Robert. No follow-up question, no real concern, just the same distracted half-attention he gives everyone whose need is not directly useful to his work in that moment. That silence is as damning as any argument the film could have scripted for him. Later in the story, when Kitty is finally given a stage, in a hearing room, cross-examined under hostile questioning, she will outperform her own husband entirely, calm, precise, immovable under pressure that visibly breaks him. The film has been building toward that single scene since this very first dinner party, quietly proving, years in advance, exactly how much capability was sitting and used at that table the entire time, waiting for a single room willing to actually ask her a serious question. Then the news arrives from Berlin. Nuclear fission has been achieved, and the film shifts almost instantly from the register of a campus drama into something closer to dread, and this transition is worth slowing down for, because it is the emotional hinge of the entire first act. Up to this point, everything Oppenheimer has done, poisoning an apple, performing brilliance in front of a room of admirers, half-loving two women at once, has been contained. The damage has had a ceiling, a ruined dinner party, a hurt girlfriend, a frustrated wife. The news of fission removes the ceiling entirely, and Oppenheimer understands the implications faster and more completely than almost anyone around him, which is exactly the problem this film has been quietly setting up since the very first Cambridge scene. A man who has spent his entire adult life needing to be the one who sees furthest, who understands deepest, who arrives first, has just been handed the single largest canvas that trait could possibly be applied to. When General Leslie Groves arrives to recruit him for what will become the Manhattan Project, the film does not portray this as coercion, and that is a deliberate choice worth naming out loud. It portrays it as recognition. Two men who see in each other exactly what they have each been looking for. Groves needing someone brilliant enough and hungry enough to actually deliver the impossible, and Oppenheimer needing, finally, a stage large enough to match the size of his own self-image. Nobody forces Robert Oppenheimer to build the atomic bomb. He walks toward it, and understanding why he walks toward it. Not the official reasons about Nazi Germany and moral necessity that the history books will later emphasize, but the private, psychological reason, the boy who could never tolerate being diminished, finally being offered a project that could never diminish him again, is the single most important piece of character work the film does before Los Alamos even appears on screen. Hold on to everything you have just watched. The apple, the lecture hall, Jean Tatlock's exhaustion, Kitty's ignored warnings. None of it is backstory. All of it is the blueprint for exactly how this story ends, and the film is betting you will forget these small, quiet failures long before it needs you to remember them again. Matt Damon plays Groves as a man almost allergic to romanticism, a career military engineer who has no patience for genius as a personality trait and every patience for genius as a delivery mechanism. And that dynamic is exactly why the recruitment scene works as well as it does. Groves does not flatter Oppenheimer. He interrogates him, bluntly, about his political associations, his temperament, his reliability, and Oppenheimer answers every uncomfortable question not by minimizing his flaws, but by essentially arguing that his flaws are the price of his usefulness, an argument Groves accepts because Groves needs the usefulness badly enough to tolerate the price. That transaction, brilliance purchased at the cost of overlooking character, is the exact mechanism that will eventually detonate his career at the security hearing years later when a different set of men decide the price is no longer worth paying. This is the first major open loop of the film, planted here and not resolved until the very final stretch of the story. A government willing to overlook a man's dangerous associations in exchange for what he can build, right up until the moment building it stops being useful to them. Hold that thought all the way through Los Alamos, all the way through Trinity, all the way to the hearing room, because the moment this film wants you to finally understand is not the explosion in the desert. It is the instant the transaction quietly flips, and the same country that needed his danger suddenly decides it can no longer afford it. Groves gives Oppenheimer a desert, and Oppenheimer does something almost nobody expected from a theoretical physicist with no administrative experience whatsoever. He builds a city. Los Alamos rises out of empty New Mexico mesa in a matter of months, and the choice of location is not incidental. This is the same landscape Oppenheimer fell in love with as a young man riding horses through it, the one place on Earth where he had ever felt something close to unguarded peace. He is not just building a laboratory here. He is building the one environment where every flaw that has defined him so far, the hunger for devotion, the need to be the indispensable center of the room, finally has a legitimate outlet. For the first time, being followed is not vanity, it is leadership. For the first time, needing to be the smartest man in every room is not an ego problem, it is a wartime necessity. Watch how comfortably he inhabits this role compared to every earlier scene in the film. He is not performing charisma here the way he performed it in a Berkeley lecture hall. He has found the one job on the planet where his exact psychological technological architecture is not a liability but a perfect fit, and that should unsettle you more than it comforts you. Because a man whose worst instincts have finally found a socially rewarded outlet is not a man who has changed. He is a man who has simply found the right stage. Some viewers watch this section of the film and see nation-building heroism, a brilliant man rising to an impossible occasion under wartime pressure most of us will never face. Other viewers watch the exact same footage and see something closer to vindication, a lifetime of social failure finally rewarded with unlimited authority, unlimited budget, and a captive audience of the most talented scientists in the world who have no choice but to listen to him. Both readings are fully supported by what the film puts on screen, and Nolan never tips his hand toward either one, which is itself a directorial choice worth naming. Compare the visual language here to the Cambridge sequences from the first act. There, the camera pressed close and uncomfortable, boxing Oppenheimer into cramped academic spaces that rejected him. At Los Alamos, for the first time, the frame widens, mesa and sky stretching out in every direction, space that finally matches the scale of his self-image. A director less deliberate than Nolan could have scored this expansion as pure triumph. Instead, the widening frame plays almost neutral, beautiful and slightly ominous at once, because an ego finally given unlimited room to expand is not automatically a good thing, even when the resulting expansion looks, from a distance, exactly like greatness. There is an irony worth sitting with here that most reviews never connect to anything earlier in the story. This is the same man who was, by his own account and the film's own earlier scenes, hopeless with his hands in a laboratory, clumsy, impatient, unsuited to the tedious mechanics of experimental work. And yet he proves to be a genuinely gifted administrator, capable of managing thousands of competing egos, competing disciplines, and competing security concerns inside a single functioning city. The skill that makes this possible is compartmentalization. The security architecture Oppenheimer designs literally separates each division from full knowledge of what the others are doing, so that no single person, aside from him, ever holds the complete picture. Now compare that structure to how he has run his own personal life for the entire film so far. Cambridge compartmentalized from Berkeley. Jean Tatlock compartmentalized from Kitty. His communist-adjacent friendships compartmentalized from his growing government responsibilities. The exact cognitive skill that makes him brilliant at building a secret city is the same skill that has made him capable of lying to the people who love him without ever quite registering it as lying. Los Alamos does not represent a new side of Robert Oppenheimer emerging under pressure. It represents his oldest, most private habit finally being given official architectural blueprints and a government budget. The scientists arrive in waves, and the film uses them efficiently, a few lines of dialogue establishing entire personalities. Klaus Fuchs is quiet, useful, unremarkable, exactly the kind of colleague nobody would ever suspect of anything. And the film lets that unremarkable quality sit on screen without comment, trusting you to feel the dramatic irony land later rather than announcing it now. Edward Teller arrives already fixated on a weapon far larger than the one anyone has asked him to build, obsessed with fusion when the entire project is organized around fission, and this is where the film plants a second, quieter argument about Oppenheimer's leadership style. He does not shut Teller down. He indulges him, gives him space, tolerates the disruption, because Oppenheimer cannot say no to a brilliant mind demanding attention. The same inability that let Chevalier keep confiding in him. The same inability that let a Berkeley lecture hall turn into a personality cult. Bohr arrives with something none of the American scientists have yet fully confronted: direct knowledge of what is happening to Jewish scientists and Jewish civilians under the regime this weapon is meant to stop, and his presence recalibrates the entire moral temperature of the project overnight. Suddenly, the abstract race against Germany has a face attached to its urgency. This is where the film does its most careful work, refusing to let the audience settle into either comfortable position, weapon as pure heroism or weapon as pure horror, because both readings are present in the same room at the same time, and Oppenheimer is the only person required to hold both without flinching. The ensemble work in this stretch of the film deserves specific credit rather than generic praise, because Nolan and his casting choices manage something genuinely difficult, establishing a dozen distinct personalities in the space of a few scenes, each without any of them feeling like a name tag. Benny Safdie's Teller reads as wounded and competitive rather than simply eccentric, a man convinced his idea is being sidelined by lesser ambition, and that specific emotional coloring matters, because it means his later betrayal at the security hearing feels like the natural conclusion of a grudge we watched form here, not a plot twist arriving out of nowhere. Compare this project's approach to earlier Manhattan Project dramatizations like Fat Man and Little Boy, which tended to flatten the the scientists into a single collective conscience debating in unison. Nolan refuses that flattening. Every scientist in this room has a slightly different relationship to the morality of what they are building. Some fully at peace with it, some quietly troubled, some, like Teller, barely thinking about the morality at all because they are already fixated on the next, larger weapon. Bohr's arrival cuts through all of that noise with the one thing none of the Americans can claim: direct, personal proximity to the atrocity this weapon is meant to answer, and his brief scenes recalibrate the entire moral temperature of the project overnight, giving the abstract race against Germany a face it did not have a moment earlier. Even the smaller figures in this ensemble earn their screen time through specificity rather than shorthand. Richard Feynman appears as a bongo-playing, safe-cracking irritant to base security, a young man treating the whole apparatus of secrecy as an amusing puzzle to be solved rather than a solemn burden to be carried. And that lightness is not comic relief for its own sake. It is a deliberate contrast to the crushing weight everyone around him is pretending not to feel. Hans Bethe provides the steady, unglamorous competence the project actually runs on, the kind of contribution that never generates a dramatic monologue, but without which nothing here functions at all. Nolan edits this entire stretch with a rhythm noticeably faster than anything in the Cambridge or Berkeley sequences, cutting between labs, dinner tables, and Grove's impatient check-ins with an urgency that mirrors the wartime clock the characters are all racing against. And that pacing choice matters because it never once lets the audience settle into comfort, mirroring exactly how none of the people living inside this project were permitted to settle into comfort either. Kitty is exiled to a smaller version of the isolation Gene Tatlock once endured, except now with children, altitude, and a barbed wire perimeter around the loneliness. She did not sign up to be a mother stationed at a secret military site, watching her husband build something he cannot name to the people who ask him about his work, and the film gives her a slow unraveling here that mirrors, almost exactly, the emotional abandonment Tatlock experienced years earlier. Robert is present in the house and absent everywhere that matters. Exactly the same failure repeated in a different marriage with higher stakes. This is the third and final plan of the loop first opened at Cambridge. A man who cannot stay still long enough to witness someone else's need, now doing it to the mother of his children while simultaneously overseeing the most consequential engineering project in human history. Notice the precision of that parallel. The film is not accusing Oppenheimer of being a bad husband as a side note. It is arguing that the exact psychological failure visible in a poisoned apple, visible in a neglected girlfriend, is now operating at the scale of a secret city and, soon, at the scale of a war. There is a specific cruelty in how the film positions Kitty's competence here that deserves attention, because it was never a mystery that she was capable. She trained as a biologist, sharp enough to have been useful to the project in almost any capacity Robert might have asked of her, and instead she is handed a garden, a household, and a rotating cast of other scientists' wives who are equally starved for anything resembling intellectual engagement. This is not incompetence finding its natural level. This is capability being actively wasted by a system and a husband that never seriously considered another arrangement. Watch how her drinking accelerates in direct proportion to how completely she is excluded from the one project consuming her husband's entire attention. And notice that the film never frames this as a personal weakness divorced from circumstance. It consistently frames it as a direct response to being made irrelevant inside her own marriage. Robert, meanwhile, is not simply busy. He is fully alive in a way he has never been fully alive at home. Animated, needed, essential to hundreds of people around him every single day, which makes his absence at home even more pointed, because it is not that he lacks the capacity for presence. He has simply decided, without ever consciously deciding, that presence belongs to whichever room currently makes him feel indispensable, and that room has never once, in the entire story so far, been the one his family is standing in. Split this apart into what the character feels and what the audience is meant to feel, because the two are not the same thing here, and the gap between them is where the film's real judgment lives. Kitty, in the moment, mostly feels boredom curdling into resentment, a specific and survivable frustration that she might, on another day, have shaken off. The audience, watching from outside that moment with the fuller picture the film has been building since Cambridge, feels something closer to alarm, because we can already see the pattern Kitty cannot yet name, a husband whose attention only ever flows toward whatever room currently confirms his importance. She is pregnant again during part of this stretch, raising an infant inside a fenced military compound she cannot fully explain to anyone outside it, and the practical isolation compounds the emotional isolation until the two become almost indistinguishable. The film never asks you to blame Kitty for any of this. It asks you to watch a genuinely capable woman shrink into the only role she has been permitted, and to notice that shrinking is not happening by accident. It is happening because expanding her role would have required a husband willing to treat his marriage with even a fraction of the seriousness he brings to a physics problem. Then comes the deceleration the film needs before it can escalate again. After the frantic montage of recruitment, construction, and the compressed urgency of a race against Germany, Nolan slows the film down deliberately, giving us quieter domestic scenes at Los Alamos, children on bicycles, wives trading gossip they are not allowed to ask real questions about, Robert and Kitty on a porch at dusk with something almost resembling tenderness between them. This is not filler. This is the exhale the story needs before Trinity, and it matters precisely because the audience needs to feel what is at stake domestically before the technical stakes take over completely. A family exists inside this secret. A marriage, however damaged, exists inside this secret. Children are growing up inside a fence built around the most dangerous idea in human history, and Nolan wants you to sit with the strangeness of ordinary life continuing to happen directly beside the extraordinary, because that contrast is what will make the detonation, when it finally comes, feel less like a spectacle and more like an intrusion into something that had, briefly, felt almost like peace. There is a useful comparison here to how other secrecy under pressure stories, something like the code-breaking community at Bletchley Park during the same war, handle the same tension between ordinary domestic life and extraordinary hidden work, because the emotional mechanics are strikingly similar. In both cases, the people living inside the secret are not permitted the relief of processing what they are doing out loud, not with neighbors, not with extended family, sometimes not even fully with each other, and that enforced silence does something specific to a community. It compresses grief, doubt, and moral unease into small domestic gestures instead: a stiff drink, a too quiet dinner, a marriage that communicates entirely in half-finished sentences. Nolan lets this stretch of the film breathe at exactly the moment the audience needs a breath, after the frantic compression of recruitment and construction, and before the story accelerates into its most technically dense and emotionally unbearable stretch. This is not simply pacing for pacing's sake. It is Nolan making sure you feel the human cost sitting quietly underneath the historic achievement before the historic achievement arrives, so that when Trinity finally happens, you are watching it happen to people you have actually spent time with on a porch at dusk, not simply to a team of anonymous scientists solving an equation. Notice the specific images Nolan chooses for this breather, because none of them are accidental. Children riding bicycles past buildings where their fathers calculate blast radii, a community dance where couples sway to a band while, somewhere on the same mesa, a bomb casing is being fitted for its first live test. This is character emotion and audience emotion pulling in opposite directions at once. The people on screen feeling something like ordinary contentment, a rare unguarded evening, while the audience, holding the full weight of what we know is being built 2 buildings over, cannot access that same contentment even for a moment. That gap is the entire point. The film is not asking you to condemn these people for finding small pockets of joy inside an impossible situation. That would be an ungenerous and frankly inhuman standard to hold anyone to. It is asking you to feel, physically, the strangeness of joy and catastrophe sharing the same zip code, because that strangeness is about to define the rest of these people's lives whether they are ready for it or not. There is also a quieter grief embedded in this sequence that only becomes visible in hindsight, once the audience knows how the rest of the story unfolds. This porch, this dance, this rare unguarded evening is close to the last stretch of the film where Robert and Kitty will be allowed anything resembling normal domestic happiness together. Everything that follows, the tests, the bombings, the fame, the hearing, will place a permanent distance between them that no evening like this one will ever fully repair. Nolan does not announce that finality. He simply lets the scene exist, warm and small, and slightly too brief, trusting the audience to feel its weight retroactively rather than being told to feel it in the moment. Germany surrenders, and the film uses this moment with surgical cruelty, because it is precisely the moment when the entire moral justification for the project should have evaporated, and it does not. The declared enemy, the one the scientists told themselves justified every compromise, every secrecy, every sacrifice, is gone, defeated by conventional forces before the bomb is even finished. And the project does not stop. Nobody in the room seriously proposes stopping it. This is the open loop that will not close until Hiroshima, and the film wants you to notice, right now, in this scene, that the stated reason for building the bomb has just been removed, and the momentum continues anyway, because momentum this large, built by men this proud, does not require a reason reason anymore. It only requires an ending. Hold that discomfort. It is about to get much heavier. Here is the detail almost no review of this film brings up, and it is the sharpest piece of evidence for exactly how compromised Oppenheimer has already become by this point in the story. A group of scientists on the project, led by Lewis Strauss, one of the very physicists whose early warning to Roosevelt helped start the entire program, circulates a petition arguing the weapon should, at minimum, be demonstrated rather than dropped directly on a civilian population, giving Japan a chance to witness its power and surrender before anyone dies. Oppenheimer sits on the committee that receives and effectively buries that petition. This is not a detail the film dramatizes with any courtroom flourish. It passes in the space of a sentence, easy to miss entirely, and that quietness is exactly the point. The single most direct, practical, achievable moral alternative available to this project is raised and dismissed almost silently by the one man in the entire story who has spent 3 acts being framed as uniquely capable of seeing further and understanding deeper than everyone around him. If he truly saw as far as the film keeps insisting he does, this is precisely the moment that argument collapses, because seeing far and choosing to act on what you see are not the same capability, and Robert Oppenheimer has just demonstrated, quietly, permanently, which one he actually possesses. The same bureaucratic quietness governs an even larger decision happening in parallel, one the film touches only briefly, but which deserves more attention than most reviews give it. A target selection committee, working alongside the interim committee overseeing the project's use, is already narrowing down which Japanese cities will be struck, a discussion conducted with the same clinical detachment as choosing a testing site, weighing population density and industrial value against the visual clarity of an undamaged city that would best demonstrate the weapon's power to the world. Kyoto is removed from consideration not on moral grounds, but because a member of the committee once vacationed there and found it too culturally significant to destroy, a detail so absurd it would read as satire if it were not historically documented. This is the machinery Oppenheimer has helped build and now sits quietly inside, a system where the largest moral decision of the century gets processed with the same bloodless efficiency as a zoning meeting, and the film wants you to understand that this diffusion of responsibility across committees, memos, and bureaucratic distance is not a flaw in the system. It is the system working exactly as every person involved, including Oppenheimer, has allowed it to. Hold on to the target selection committee and the buried Szilard petition together as a single idea moving forward, because they are two halves of the same argument. Nobody in this story needs to be a villain for the worst outcome imaginable to happen. They only need to be reasonable, busy, and quietly unwilling to be the one person who stops the machine. Robert Oppenheimer had more standing than almost anyone alive to be that person, and the film is about to show you, in unbearable detail, exactly what happens the one time he finally, briefly, tries. The final stretch before the test is where the film lets its most brilliant minds look, for the first time, genuinely frightened rather than merely rushed. The implosion design, the mechanism required to compress plutonium evenly enough to trigger a chain reaction, has been the project's most stubborn technical problem for months, and Nolan spends real screen time on the specific engineering anxiety rather than reducing it to a montage of scribbled equations. Explosive lenses have to detonate in a perfect sphere simultaneously, down to fractions of a microsecond, or the entire device fails, and the film lets you feel how close failure sat to the surface of every single day at Los Alamos in this stretch. Then comes the detail almost no other adaptation of this story treats with the seriousness it deserves. Before the test, a betting pool circulates among the scientists, dark, half-joking, entirely serious underneath the joke, on whether the detonation might ignite the atmosphere itself and destroy the planet. Edward Teller had raised the theoretical possibility earlier in the project, and though the calculations were revisited and the risk was judged effectively negligible, negligible is not zero, and these are the smartest men in the world choosing to proceed anyway, wagering cigarettes and dollars on an outcome that, in its worst case, ends everyone placing the bet. Watch how casually this is treated on screen. That casualness is not the film failing to dramatize the stakes. It is the film showing you exactly how normalized existential risk becomes once ambition has enough momentum behind it. Enrico Fermi, in particular, is shown running his own private book on the odds, and the film lets his dry, almost mathematical detachment sit uncomfortably against the actual content of the wager. This is a man treating the potential end of the world as an interesting probability problem, and the horror of that scene is not that Fermi is uniquely callous. It is that his reaction is entirely consistent with the specific kind of mind this entire project has selected selected for from the very beginning, minds trained to compartmentalize emotional weight in favor of clean calculation. The exact skill that makes them brilliant physicists and the exact skill that makes them capable of joking about apocalypse the night before triggering it. Compare this stretch of the film to how conventional disaster movies typically build anticipation, usually through mounting external obstacles, a villain, a ticking clock controlled by someone else. Here, the obstacle is entirely internal, a decision these men have already made, a risk they have already accepted, and the tension is not whether the device will detonate, but whether accepting that risk at all reveals something damning about everyone who agreed to run it. Nolan lingers on close, sweat-lined faces during this stretch rather than wide, action-oriented shots, keeping the emotional register intimate and claustrophobic even as the stakes swell to planetary scale. And that visual choice mirrors the entire thesis of the film so far. Catastrophe, in this story, is never a spectacle happening to strangers. It is always the accumulated weight of specific, identifiable people choosing, one decision at a time, to keep going. There is also a specific irony in who is running these calculations. Teller, whose fusion obsession the film already flagged in the previous act as a warning sign of unchecked ambition, is the same man whose theoretical concern about atmospheric ignition forced the entire team to stop and rerun their math before proceeding. In other words, the character the film has been quietly coding as reckless is, in this specific instance, the one voice of genuine caution, and Oppenheimer, positioned throughout the film as uniquely capable of seeing the full moral picture, is the one who ultimately authorizes moving forward regardless. This inversion matters because it undercuts any simple story where Oppenheimer is wise and his colleagues are merely enthusiastic. Caution and recklessness do not divide cleanly along a single character's temperament here. They show up unpredictably in different people at different moments, and the only person with the actual institutional authority to stop the test, the only voice whose objection could have carried real weight with Groves and Washington, chooses instead to trust a recalculated risk assessment that reduces catastrophe to an acceptable percentage. That is the precise moment ambition stops being a personality trait and becomes a policy, one small, defensible-sounding decision that will echo through every larger, far less defensible decision still to come. The night before the test, the film finally lets Oppenheimer's fear surface without a mask over it. He has spent 3 acts performing confidence for Groves, for his scientists, for Kitty, for himself, and here, alone, stripped of an audience to perform for, we see something closer to the truth. This is not the fear of a man worried his invention might not work. It is the fear of a man who understands, with total clarity, that it almost certainly will. Kitty waits at Los Alamos with the other wives, none of them permitted to know exactly what is happening in the desert that night, all of them understanding, in the vague, dread-soaked way military secrecy allows, that whatever it is enormous. The film does not give her a dramatic confrontation scene here, and that absence is deliberate. There is nothing left to confront. The decision was made months ago by a man who never once brought her fully into the room where it happened, and all that remains for her now is waiting. The exact position she has occupied since Los Alamos began. Given no vote in an outcome, she will have to live inside for the rest of her life regardless. Ask yourself what you would do in her position, married to the one man on earth who knows exactly what is about to happen a few hours drive away, and given nothing but a vague instruction to wait for news. Would you be able to sleep? Would you resent the marriage that put you in that room? Or would you tell yourself that resentment is an unaffordable luxury when the outcome could reshape the entire war? The film does not answer this for you, and it should not, because Kitty herself does not seem to have settled on an answer either. What the film does show, with real precision, is the specific texture of powerlessness inside an intimate relationship, not the dramatic powerlessness of being silenced or threatened, but the quieter, more corrosive powerlessness of simply never being consulted in the first place. Robert does not hide the test from her out of malice. He hides it, and has hidden nearly everything from her for years now, because consulting her was never part of how he processes anything, personal or professional. That is a distinction worth sitting with, because it means the damage in this marriage was never really about secrecy for its own sake. It was about a fundamental unwillingness to treat his wife as a full participant in his life rather than a supportive backdrop to it. And by the night before Trinity, that unwillingness has calcified into something neither of them any longer even bothers to name out loud. There is a version of this story, a more conventional biopic, that would use this night before Trinity for a big cathartic confrontation. Kitty finally confronting Robert about years of exclusion, tears, and raised voices resolving into a fragile reconciliation before the test. This film refuses that scene entirely, and the refusal is itself a form of honesty about how long-term neglect actually functions inside a real marriage. It rarely resolves in a single dramatic conversation. It calcifies into a shared, unspoken agreement to simply continue, because the alternative, actually reckoning with how much distance has grown between two people, requires a kind of stillness neither of them can currently afford, not with a test happening in the desert, not with a war still grinding on, not with careers and reputations balanced on outcomes still hours away. Kitty's waiting in this stretch is not passive suffering, either. The film gives her small, sharp moments of composure among the other wives, managing their anxiety, projecting a calm she does not fully feel, doing for this community exactly the kind of leadership work her husband is simultaneously doing miles away in the desert, unpaid, unacknowledged, and entirely invisible to the men who will later write the official history of this night. The test itself is where Nolan's specific filmmaking philosophy pays off most completely, because this sequence was built almost entirely with practical effects. No CGI mushroom cloud, real explosives and controlled detonations captured on film and later composited with the actors' reactions, and that choice is not a technical footnote. It is the entire emotional architecture of the scene. When you watch the countdown, the goggles going up over frightened eyes, the scientists lying flat in trenches miles from the tower, you are watching something that actually happened in front of a camera, not something generated afterward in a computer, and the difference registers on some pre-conscious level even for viewers who could not articulate why the moment feels so physically real. Nolan strips the sound design down to almost nothing in the final seconds before detonation, letting the countdown play against near silence, denying the audience the swelling orchestral cue every disaster film has trained us to expect, and that absence of music is the loudest choice in the entire sequence. It is worth being specific about why the practical effects approach matters beyond simple technical bragging rights, because the choice is inseparable from the film's larger argument. A CGI explosion, however sophisticated, is always legible to the audience as an artifact, a constructed image built to represent danger rather than a record of danger that actually existed in front of a lens. By insisting on real detonations, filmed practically and only enhanced afterward, Nolan is making a quiet claim about authenticity that extends beyond visual style into the film's entire moral project. This happened, this force was real, no metaphor or digital abstraction stands between you and the actual physics being unleashed. Compare this to how countless other films render moments of world historical danger, usually through spectacle designed primarily to thrill, explosions choreographed for maximum visual pleasure. Nolan denies the audience that pleasure almost entirely. The build-up is clinical, procedural, filled with radio checks and countdown numbers and men lying face down in trenches with their backs turned, because pleasure was never the intended audience response here. Dread was, and every technical choice in this sequence, the sound design, the practical photography, the refusal of a triumphant score, is calibrated toward dread rather than awe. Even in the seconds before the awe becomes unavoidable, the weather itself becomes an antagonist in these final hours. A thunderstorm rolling toward the test site threatening to delay or scrub the detonation entirely, and Groves and Oppenheimer argue, tensely, about whether to proceed despite the risk of the storm interfering with instrumentation or, worse, the possibility of a lightning strike triggering the device early. This is a small, procedural crisis compared to everything else the film has built toward, but it earns its place in the sequence because it reintroduces, one final time, the theme of momentum overriding caution. The test could be delayed. Safety would argue for delay. It proceeds anyway, on a tighter schedule than the scientists would have chosen under ideal conditions, because too much has already been invested politically, financially, psychologically, for anyone with real authority to be the person who says wait. Watch how Groves, a man defined throughout the film by blunt pragmatism, ultimately defers to Oppenheimer's read of the weather window rather than his own instinct for caution. One final small transfer of authority from a career military officer to a physicist that will look, in hindsight, like the exact moment institutional caution formally surrendered to scientific urgency for good. Compare this weather crisis to a more conventional thriller's ticking clock, and the difference in intent becomes clear. A conventional film would use the storm purely for suspense, a mechanical obstacle raising tension before a payoff. Here, the storm functions almost as a final off-ramp the story refuses to take. One last, mundane, entirely explicable reason the test could have been postponed without anyone losing face, without any scientific principle being compromised, simply a reasonable delay for reasonable safety. The film lets you register that off-ramp clearly enough to notice it being declined. This is consistent with everything the story has shown you since the Szilard petition was quietly buried, since Germany's surrender failed to slow anything down. Every opportunity for pause in this narrative is treated as a technical inconvenience to be solved rather than a genuine invitation to reconsider, and by the time the storm clears just enough for the countdown to resume, the audience should already understand that no weather condition, no ethical committee, no petition was ever actually going to be the thing that stopped this machine. Then the light arrives before the sound does, exactly as it did at the real Trinity test, and Nolan holds on Cillian Murphy's face for an unbearable stretch of silence before the shockwave finally reaches the observation trench. And in that gap between light and sound, the film compresses its entire argument into a single unbroken shot. This is character emotion and audience emotion converging completely for the only time in the film. Oppenheimer's face moves through something that looks almost like religious awe and something that looks almost like horror, occupying both simultaneously without resolving into either one, and the audience, watching alongside him, is denied the comfort of a clean emotional cue telling us which reaction is correct. The Bhagavad Gita line surfaces here not as a scripted piece of dialogue delivered for effect, but as something closer to a private, involuntary thought, ancient words rising up because nothing built in the 20th century was equipped to describe what he has just watched. Around him, the reaction in the bunker splits almost immediately, some scientists cheering, embracing, weeping with relief that the impossible has actually worked, others staring at the fading light in complete, frozen silence, and the film refuses to tell you which group got it right, because both groups are right, and that is precisely the horror of the moment. Notice how long Nolan holds this shot compared to almost anything else in the film. Every other emotionally significant moment so far has been compressed, a marriage's disintegration handled in a handful of scenes, a friendship's betrayal delivered in a single conversation. Here, time itself seems to warp, the gap between the flash and the sound stretching far beyond what a viewer's internal clock expects, and that stretching is not simply an accurate recreation of the physics of light outrunning sound across several miles of desert. It is the film forcing you to sit, uncomfortably, inside a threshold moment, a before that can never again become an after, for exactly as long as it takes for the true scale of what has happened to become undeniable. When the sound and the shock wave finally arrive, it does not simply startle the characters. It seems to physically reorganize something in the observation trench, bodies flinching in near unison, faces catching light that has no natural precedent on Earth. This is the single moment in the entire film where the fission and fusion structure, the color and black and white timelines that otherwise never touch, feel closest to converging, because everything Strauss will later weaponize against Oppenheimer, every accusation, every political maneuver, exists only because this exact moment, right here, worked. The bomb's success is not incidental to the hearing that destroys his career years later. It is the entire precondition for it. Without this flash of light in a New Mexico desert, there is no fame large enough to make Oppenheimer worth destroying, and no achievement significant enough to make his later doubt so unforgivable to the men who once needed his certainty. There is one more detail worth naming before the celebration begins, because it is easy to lose inside the sheer visual force of the explosion. The film briefly shows the physical toll of proximity. The residual heat felt even at a distance meant to be safe, dust and light behaving in ways nobody in the trench has ever witnessed before, a stark, physical reminder that whatever else this moment represents philosophically, it is also, simply, dangerous. Radiation and blast force with no regard whatsoever for the moral weight anyone assigns to it after the fact. The film resists the temptation to let this remain purely symbolic. It insists, quietly, on the literal, bodily reality of the event, because everything that follows, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the decades of nuclear anxiety this test effectively inaugurated, depends on audiences never being allowed to fully abstract this weapon into metaphor. It has to remain, throughout the rest of the film, a physical fact with physical consequences, however much analysis and interpretation gets layered on top of it in the decades that follow. Back at Los Alamos, word spreads that the test succeeded, and a genuine, uncomplicated wave of celebration moves through the community. Champagne, dancing, the particular euphoria of an impossible engineering problem finally solved after years of grinding uncertainty. Oppenheimer, briefly, is allowed to be a hero without qualification, applauded, embraced, the undisputed center of the one room he has spent his entire life trying to be the center of. Hold on to how good this moment is allowed to feel, because the film needs you to feel it fully before it takes it away. The device works. Nobody has died yet because of it. The atmosphere has not ignited. In this narrow window, before the weapon has actually been used against another human being, the story story allows itself and its protagonist a genuine, unclouded triumph. It will be the last one either of them gets. Watch Oppenheimer's face specifically in the middle of the celebration, because Nolan gives it away here if you are paying attention, a half second of something that does not belong in an uncomplicated victory. A flicker of the same expression he wore in the observation trench, curdling almost imperceptibly at the edges into something closer to dread, gone again before anyone around him notices it. Everyone else in the room is celebrating a solved equation. He is the only person present who has already, quietly, begun calculating what comes next, because he understands something the rest of the celebrating crowd has not yet had to confront. A working weapon is not the end of this story, it is an obligation. Somewhere, a decision is already being made about where and when this device will actually be used against living human beings, and Oppenheimer, more than anyone else on Earth at this exact moment, understands that he no longer has any real control over that decision, only the diminishing illusion that his voice in the room still matters. Hold this half-second flicker in your memory as we move forward, because it is the last time in the entire film you will see Robert Oppenheimer look genuinely uncertain before the fact rather than genuinely guilty after it, and the distance between those two expressions is about to become the entire remainder of his life. Some viewers read this celebration scene as the film's one moment of genuine triumph before everything curdles, a well-earned release after years of grinding tension. Others read the same scene, knowing what is coming, as almost unbearable to watch precisely because of how genuine the joy is, dramatic irony functioning here not as cleverness, but as a kind of cruelty the film is willing to inflict on its own audience. Both readings sit comfortably inside the same footage, and that duality is worth carrying forward, because the rest of the film will keep returning to this exact tension, moments of real human warmth sitting directly beside consequences the characters experiencing that warmth cannot yet see coming. What happens next moves fast, days rather than months, and it will strip away nearly everything this celebration currently feels like it earned. Would you have wanted to feel what this room feels, even knowing what you know now, watching from decades in the future with the entire subsequent history of nuclear weapons already visible to you? It is worth asking that question honestly rather than rhetorically, because the easy answer, the one that lets you feel morally superior to everyone in that celebrating crowd, is probably not an honest one. Relief this large, after years of grinding, secretive, existentially weighted labor, is not something most people could resist feeling in the moment, regardless of what that relief eventually costs someone else, somewhere else, in a city most of the people in this room have never visited and could not locate on a map. The film is not asking you to forgive that celebration. It is asking you to recognize how ordinary, how human, how nearly universal that celebration would have felt from the inside, because moral clarity is almost always easier to access from a safe historical distance than it ever was in the actual room where the decision and the relief were happening in real time. The news reaches Los Alamos over the radio, stripped of any of the visceral detail the men and women who built the weapon might have expected to feel entitled to. Hiroshima has been destroyed, a city of civilians reduced to ash and radiation sickness in a single instant, and the community that spent years engineering exactly this outcome learns about its success the same way the rest of the country does, through a broadcast announcement with none of the specificity of what actually happened on the ground. This distance matters enormously to how the film handles Oppenheimer's reaction. He does not see photographs of the dead. He does not hear first-hand testimony from survivors. He experiences the single most consequential act of his life entirely through abstraction, official numbers, a presidential statement, the sanitized language of a government press release, and that abstraction is precisely what allows pride and horror to occupy the exact same moment inside him without one immediately overwhelming the other. This is the film returning, one final devastating time, to the compartmentalization established as his defining trait since the very first act. He built a mental architecture capable of walling off Cambridge from Berkeley, Tatlock from Kitty, ambition from consequence, and now that same architecture is the only thing standing between him and having to fully absorb, all at once, exactly what his life's work has just done to tens of thousands of people he will never meet and never have to look in the eye. There is a version of moral reckoning that requires proximity, seeing a face, hearing a voice, standing in a wrecked street, and the entire structure of modern warfare, this film argues, is built specifically to deny its architects that proximity. Oppenheimer designed and delivered a weapon whose entire operational logic depends on distance, detonated from thousands of feet in the air, its effects measured afterward in aggregate statistics rather than individual suffering, and now he receives the news of its use through exactly that same distancing apparatus, a radio broadcast, a number, an official tone of triumph. Compare this to Bohr's earlier arrival at Los Alamos, carrying direct, unmediated knowledge of Jewish suffering under the regime the bomb was originally built to stop. That knowledge was visceral, embodied, impossible to abstract away. Hiroshima reaches Oppenheimer through the opposite channel entirely. Mediated, official, sanitized, and the film is quietly asking whether a man capable of building something this consequential while remaining this insulated from its human cost was ever actually equipped to weigh that cost honestly in the first place, or whether the entire apparatus of modern government secrecy was specifically designed to ensure men like him never had to. This is also the moment the film's dual timeline structure begins to matter more than it has so far. Everything the audience has watched up to now belongs to the color-saturated, first-person Oppenheimer timeline, filtered entirely through his own subjective memory and self-justification. The black-and-white Strauss timeline, running in parallel elsewhere in the film, exists specifically to interrupt that subjectivity with an outside, more skeptical perspective, and the closer the story gets to this moment of abstracted, radio-delivered devastation, the more the audience should start to feel the absence of any perspective from Hiroshima itself. Nolan makes a deliberate choice never to show the bombing from the perspective of its victims, and that omission has drawn real criticism, some of it fair, but understood inside the film's larger design. The omission is doing specific work. It forces the audience to experience exactly the same insulated, second-hand version of the atrocity that Oppenheimer himself experiences, denying us the moral clarity that direct witness would provide, and trapping us, uncomfortably, inside the same abstraction that allowed him to build the weapon in the first place. Then comes the auditorium, and this sequence is the single most formally daring stretch in the entire film. The moment Nolan finally lets the subjective camera fully collapse the distance between Oppenheimer's internal state and the audience's experience of the scene. The crowd is euphoric, stomping feet, cheering, treating him as a conquering hero returned from an impossible mission, and for a few seconds the film lets that triumph feel completely earned, completely uncomplicated, exactly the validation his entire psychology has been chasing since Cambridge. Then the sound design begins to fracture. The stomping feet grow louder than the room could physically produce, closer to a bomb blast than applause, and Oppenheimer's vision starts to warp, a blinding flash washing out a woman's face in the crowd until her skin appears to peel and disintegrate in front of him, gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced instantly by ordinary, cheering faces as if nothing happened at all. This is not a literal hallucination the film asks you to take as objective reality. It is the closest the movie ever comes to showing you, rather than telling you, what it might feel like to be congratulated for an act of mass killing you cannot yet allow yourself to consciously name as one. Watch how Cillian Murphy plays the speech itself, the forced enthusiasm curdling almost visibly in real time. Words about pride in the achievement catching in his throat as though his own mouth no longer fully believes what it is saying. This sequence rewards close comparison to the Trinity detonation from the previous act, because the two scenes are clearly built as mirror images of each other. Trinity gave the audience light before sound, a stretched, unbearable gap between cause and consequence, ending in genuine, if complicated, celebration. The auditorium inverts that structure entirely, sound arriving as violent excess, feet stomping louder than physically possible, while the visual horror intrudes suddenly and briefly rather than building with slow dread. Where Trinity asked the audience to sit inside anticipation, the auditorium scene asks the audience to sit inside intrusion, the horror arriving unbidden into a moment that is supposed to feel like unambiguous triumph. Exactly the way Oppenheimer's own guilt will continue to arrive, unbidden and uncontrollable for the rest of the film. Some viewers read this hallucination as evidence of genuine psychological breakdown, a man beginning to fracture under guilt in real time. Others read it more skeptically, as a moment of self-mythologizing anguish. Oppenheimer casting himself as tragic and haunted precisely when the room is asking him to simply accept credit, a final, almost involuntary performance of suffering that lets him feel the weight of what happened without having to do anything about it. Both readings are defensible, and the ambiguity is not a flaw in the writing. It is the entire point of building a film from inside the unreliable memory of a man who has spent his whole life needing to be understood as more thoughtful than everyone around him. There is also a sound design detail worth isolating on its own, because it connects backward across the entire film in a way that rewards a second viewing. The tremor motif planted at Cambridge, under the poisoned apple, under the humiliation, under the boy who could not tolerate weight being diminished, returns here at full volume, no longer a subtle undertone, but the dominant sonic force in the entire sequence. That is not simply an intensity escalation for dramatic effect. It is the film explicitly connecting a private, adolescent psychological wound to a historical atrocity through the literal continuity of its score, arguing, in the language of sound rather than dialogue, that these two things were never actually separate phenomena, one small and one catastrophic, but a single continuous thread of unresolved need running the entire length of one man's life, simply given. Eventually, a canvas large enough to make the wound legible to the entire world. 3 days later, Nagasaki is destroyed, and the film handles this second bombing with a deliberate, almost clinical brevity that says more than a longer treatment could have. There is far less debate over Nagasaki in the historical record, and far less screen time devoted to it here, and that imbalance is itself an argument. The first bomb could be framed, however uncomfortably, as a singular, unprecedented demonstration of force intended to end a war quickly. The second bomb, dropped before Japan's government had even fully processed the first, before any formal surrender negotiation had meaningfully progressed, is harder to justify under that same framing, and the film does not attempt to justify it. It simply lets the fact sit there, unresolved, a second city destroyed largely because the machinery set in motion months earlier could not easily be stopped once it started moving. The same momentum over reflection pattern the film has been tracking since the Cillian petition was quietly buried and the Target Committee removed Kyoto from consideration for reasons having nothing to do with morality. There is a moral dilemma worth sitting with here rather than rushing past. At what point does a weapon's demonstrated success end the justification for using it again, and who inside a government machine this large actually has the standing to ask that question before the second strike rather than after it? Oppenheimer, by every account the film has built so far, possessed more scientific authority than almost anyone in the country to raise exactly this question in the days between the two bombings. He does not raise it, at least not with any force the film chooses to show us, and that silence is arguably more damning than anything he said afterward to Truman, because expressing guilt after the fact costs him nothing, while objecting to Nagasaki before it happened might have actually changed something. The film's restraint in dramatizing this gap, refusing to invent a confrontation scene that historical evidence does not clearly support, is itself a kind of honesty, but it leaves the audience to sit with an uncomfortable question the movie will not answer for you. Was Robert Oppenheimer's later anguish a genuine moral awakening, or was it simply easier to feel guilty about a decision after it had already been made and could no longer be undone? Some viewers will find that framing too harsh, arguing that Oppenheimer had already been effectively sidelined from operational military decisions by this point, that the choice to drop a second bomb was made by military and political leadership without meaningful scientific input at all, and that reading has real historical support. But the film is not primarily interested in the narrow question of formal authority. It is interested in moral authority, in the specific weight a man's public silence carries when he is the single most famous, most credentialed, most publicly identified figure behind the weapon in question. Formal power and moral standing are not the same currency, and Robert Oppenheimer, whatever his actual bureaucratic authority in August of 1945, possessed more of the second kind than almost any other living person on Earth. The film's quiet accusation is not that he could have stopped Nagasaki through direct action. It is that he never even seems to have tried to use the one form of power he unambiguously possessed, and that omission will follow him, unacknowledged by history for decades, into every subsequent argument he makes about weapons, ethics, and restraint. At what point does silence become a form of consent, and does that standard change depending on how much power the silent person actually holds? These are the kinds of questions the film leaves for its audience rather than resolving on screen, and they are worth sitting with longer than the runtime allows, because they extend well beyond one physicist in 1945. Every large-scale harm in modern history involves some number of people positioned close enough to influence the outcome and distant enough to plausibly claim they could not have changed it. And the uncomfortable truth this film keeps circling back to is that moral responsibility rarely announces itself as a single dramatic choice. It usually looks like this: a meeting not called, an objection not raised, a petition quietly filed away, each individually defensible, collectively catastrophic. The meeting with President Truman is where the transactional nature of Oppenheimer's entire relationship with government power finally becomes explicit rather than implied. Ushered into the Oval Office as the celebrated architect of victory, Oppenheimer instead tells Truman, haltingly, that he feels he has blood on his hands, and the president's reaction is immediate and withering, dismissing the sentiment outright. agreed, later privately describing Oppenheimer to aides as a crybaby scientist he never wants to see in that office again. This single exchange recontextualizes everything the film built in its first act. The recruitment scene with Groves, the implicit bargain that brilliance would be tolerated and rewarded in exchange for delivering the impossible. That bargain is now visibly expiring in real time. Truman does not need Oppenheimer's conscience. He needed his physics. And now that the physics has been delivered and detonated twice successfully, Oppenheimer's doubt is not received as moral seriousness. It is received as an inconvenience from an employee who has finished the only job he was actually hired to do. Watch the specific way this scene is staged, because the power dynamics are communicated almost entirely through blocking rather than dialogue. Oppenheimer enters the Oval Office still carrying the posture of the man who commanded an entire secret city, expecting, on some level, to be treated as an equal partner in the outcome he delivered. Truman, seated, controlling the pace and tone of the entire exchange from behind his desk, quickly and efficiently reasserts the actual hierarchy at play, reminding Oppenheimer, without ever needing to say it outright, that history will remember this decision as the president's, not the scientist's. The bomb belongs to the country now. It never belonged to the man who built it, and the fantasy that his moral qualms carry any real weight in a room like this evaporates within a single conversation. This is the second explicit closure of an open loop first planted at the Groves recruitment scene all the way back in the first act, a bargain built on tolerating a brilliant man's danger in exchange for what he can deliver, now revealing its final, unspoken clause. Once delivery is complete, tolerance for the danger expires immediately. And nobody in power owes him gratitude for the very qualities that made him useful in the first place. Compare Truman's brief, dismissive treatment of Oppenheimer here to how Groves treated him at the beginning of the project: patient, accommodating, willing to tolerate a difficult personality because the payoff justified the friction. The film wants you to notice how quickly that patience evaporates once the payoff has already been collected. Groves needed something from Oppenheimer that did not yet exist. Truman needs nothing further from him at all, and the film is making an argument here that extends well beyond one physicist's career. Institutional tolerance for a brilliant, difficult person is almost always conditional on ongoing usefulness, not on any genuine appreciation of the person's character or conscience, and the moment that usefulness expires, the tolerance disappears with startling speed. Robert Oppenheimer spent his entire adult life mistaking the first kind of tolerance for the second kind of respect, and the Oval Office is where that mistake becomes visible to him for the first time, delivered not through cruelty exactly, but through simple, bureaucratic indifference, which may be a colder and more permanent kind of rejection than outright hostility would have been. Robert Downey Jr.'s Lewis Strauss, though barely present in this stretch of the film, deserves a mention here, because the black and white timeline occasionally intercuts with these color scenes just enough to remind you that someone is watching Oppenheimer's rise with an attention that is anything but friendly. Strauss will later claim, under oath, that a specific slight from Oppenheimer during this general period, a moment of public condescension in front of colleagues, planted the seed of a personal grudge that eventually metastasized into a coordinated campaign to destroy his career. Whether that grudge was ever really about a single remark, or whether it was always about something closer to what this section of the film has been building toward, resentment at watching a flawed, doubtful, morally compromised man receive precisely the kind of unconditional admiration Strauss has spent his entire career chasing and never quite achieving, is a question the film will force you to answer for yourself in the acts still ahead. He leaves Los Alamos not long after, and the film treats his departure with a strange, muted quiet compared to the frantic urgency of everything that built the place. There is no dramatic breakdown, no public renunciation of the work, only a tired man packing up a life he built in the desert, returning to a country that will spend the next several years alternately celebrating him as a scientific hero and quietly beginning to wonder whether a man who built the bomb and then expressed doubt about using it can still be fully trusted. Hold that emerging tension, because it is about to define the entire next chapter of his life. The war that made Robert Oppenheimer useful enough to be forgiven almost anything is over. What remains is a peacetime government deciding, in far less forgiving terms, exactly how much doubt a famous man is allowed to express out loud before that doubt itself becomes the problem. Tell me in the comments how you would have handled that Oval Office meeting if you had been standing in Robert Oppenheimer's shoes, because there is no comfortable answer available. Say nothing, accept the applause, and you carry a private, permanent guilt no one will ever ask you to account for. Say what he said, however haltingly, and you become, almost instantly, a liability to the very government that just spent years protecting and funding you. The film does not offer a third option, because in the world it depicts, there does not appear to have been one. What Oppenheimer carries out of that office is not simply personal shame. It is the first concrete evidence that the relationship between scientific conscience and political power in this new atomic age is fundamentally, structurally adversarial, and that discovery will define nearly every decision he makes for the remainder of his public life. As he moves from the desert back into Washington rooms filled with men who increasingly see his hesitation not as wisdom earned through unique experience, but as a threat to be managed, monitored, and eventually, quietly, removed. Before we move forward, hold this image in your mind. A man walking out of Los Alamos not as a villain, not yet as a victim, but as someone who has just discovered, in the most brutal possible way, that the country he served will remember his usefulness far more readily than it will ever remember his conscience. Everything in the remainder of this story, the arms race, the hydrogen bomb debate, the growing political suspicion, the hearing that eventually strips him of everything he built his identity around, grows directly out of that single, quiet discovery. This is the moment the film's two timelines are truly set in motion toward their eventual collision, the celebrated scientist walking one direction, and somewhere else, largely unseen by Oppenheimer himself at this point. A bitter, ambitious bureaucrat named Lewis Strauss is already beginning to notice him, already beginning to resent the size of the shadow this haunted, doubtful, world-famous man casts over rooms Strauss believes should belong to him instead. Some viewers read the entire remainder of the film as Strauss's revenge story, a bitter man engineering the downfall of a rival. Others read it, more accurately in my view, as something closer to a mirror image, two proud men, wounded in different ways, both willing to sacrifice almost anything to avoid feeling small again. One having already had his moment of unlimited power in a desert, the other about to have his chance to take it away. Keep both readings active as we move forward, because the film wants you holding them simultaneously, right up until the very end, when it finally reveals exactly how those two threads were connected all along. Peacetime does not return Robert Oppenheimer to obscurity. It does something far stranger. It turns him into the most famous scientist alive, his face on magazine covers, his opinions solicited on subjects far beyond physics, a public intellectual whose wartime achievement has been quietly reframed by the culture as unambiguous heroism, even as he privately carries the unresolved dread the film has spent 2 acts building inside him. He becomes chairman of the General Advisory Committee to the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission, a position that hands him more institutional influence over the future of nuclear policy than almost anyone else in the country. And for a brief window, this looks like exactly the redemption arc a more conventional film would have delivered from the beginning. A man who once built the bomb now positioned to responsibly steward it. Watch how comfortably Oppenheimer wears this new authority, advising presidents, testifying before Congress, treated with a deference that flatters every instinct the film has spent building since Cambridge. He has once again found a room large enough to match his self-image. Only this time the room comes with actual formal power attached to it, and the film wants you to notice how easily celebrity and genuine moral authority become confused with each other in a culture desperate for its most consequential scientist to also be its conscience. There is a specific kind of danger in this arrangement that the film lets you feel rather than states outright. A man who has spent his entire life needing the room to confirm his importance has just been handed the largest, most prestigious room available in American public life. Presidential advisor, magazine cover subject, the physicist Americans trust to tell them the bomb was not simply an act of destruction, but a necessary, even noble achievement. Compare this celebrity status to the isolated, humiliated Cambridge student from the very first act, publicly diminished by a professor who saw him as a nuisance. The distance between those two versions of the same man is almost the entire story so far, and the post-war years represent the furthest point of that arc. The moment his hunger for validation finally receives more validation than any single person could reasonably metabolize. Watch how the film frames the photographs and magazine profiles from this period. Slightly too composed, slightly too aware of the camera. A man who has learned to perform gravitas the same way he once performed brilliance in a Berkeley lecture hall. This is not cynicism on the film's part. It is a continuation of the same argument it has been making from the beginning. Robert Oppenheimer has never simply existed inside a role. He has always needed to be seen occupying it. And the difference between scientific conscience and scientific celebrity, a distinction that will matter enormously by the time this story reaches its ending, is not one he has ever been able to reliably draw for himself. There is a specific irony worth noting in how the government frames his celebrity during this period, presenting him publicly as a moral authority on the very weapon he built, a scientist-statesman uniquely positioned to guide the nation through the ethical complexities of the atomic age, while privately, in the rooms that actually decide policy, treating his opinions as merely advisory, useful for public relations, but not remotely binding on any real decision. This gap between his symbolic authority and his actual influence is invisible to the public, invisible for a while even to Oppenheimer himself, who seems genuinely to believe, in this stretch of the film, that his position on the General Advisory Committee carries the weight his fame suggests it should. The film is setting up a collision it will not resolve for 2 more acts, between the version of Robert Oppenheimer that magazine covers have constructed, wise, humbled, appropriately haunted by what he built, and the version of Robert Oppenheimer that men like Strauss, and, eventually, an entire congressional hearing room, will insist on seeing instead, unreliable, potentially disloyal. A security risk dressed up in the borrowed authority of scientific celebrity. The hydrogen bomb debate is where Oppenheimer's post-war authority finally gets tested against something larger than his own reputation. Edward Teller, still chasing the fusion weapon the film flagged as a warning sign back at Los Alamos, now pushes hard for a full-scale program to build what the scientists privately call the super, a weapon with destructive potential vastly exceeding anything used against Japan. Oppenheimer, along with most of the General Advisory Committee, formally recommends against pursuing it, citing both the staggering scale of civilian casualties any use would guarantee and a genuine hope that restraint by the United States might slow a runaway arms race with the Soviets before it becomes unstoppable. This is the closest the film ever comes to showing you an Oppenheimer whose caution is not tangled up with self-interest, a man arguing, for once, against expanding his own legacy rather than toward it. Notice how differently this argument lands compared to the Szilard petition scene from earlier in the story. There, Oppenheimer sat quietly on the side of momentum. Here, for the first time, he places himself directly in its path, and the film lets you feel the genuine, if belated, moral seriousness of that choice, even as it refuses to let you forget how much easier this particular stand is to take now that his own fame and legacy are already permanently secured. Some viewers will see genuine moral courage in Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb, a man finally using his hard-won authority to argue for restraint at real professional cost. Others will see something closer to a carefully calculated legacy play, a scientist who has already achieved the singular, defining triumph of his career, positioning himself now as its responsible conscience, opposing an even more terrible weapon specifically because he no longer needs a second Trinity to secure his place in history, and can't afford the reputational cost of standing against the military establishment in a way a younger, hungrier Oppenheimer never could have. Both readings are available in the same footage, and the ambiguity is worth sitting with rather than resolving too quickly. What is not ambiguous is the substance of the argument itself, and the film is careful to let it breathe. A weapon exponentially more destructive than the one already used against Japan, capable of leveling entire regions rather than single cities, developed not because any adversary has yet built one, but because the temptation to build the largest possible weapon has, throughout this entire story, consistently proven stronger than any argument for restraint. Teller does not merely want to build the super. He needs to build it in exactly the same compulsive, validation-seeking register the film first established through Oppenheimer himself back at Los Alamos. And watching Oppenheimer now stand against that exact same compulsion in someone else is one of the film's most quietly devastating ironies. There is also a thematic thread worth naming explicitly here, because it is one of the 2 or 3 ideas the entire film ultimately lands on: the impossibility of controlling an idea once it has been proven possible. Oppenheimer's argument against the hydrogen bomb is not primarily technical. It is closer to a metaphysical warning, an insistence that some weapons, once their theoretical feasibility is demonstrated, become effectively inevitable regardless of any single nation's restraint, because the knowledge itself cannot be contained, only delayed. This is, in miniature, the exact argument the film has been making about Oppenheimer's own psychology since Cambridge. Once a capability exists inside a person or inside a species, the temptation to use it eventually overwhelms almost any argument for restraint. Teller understood this instinctively, which is why his advocacy for the super never wavers regardless of the moral objections raised against it. Oppenheimer, having lived the exact process Teller is now repeating at a larger scale, argues against it with the specific authority of someone who has already watched this pattern complete itself once and knows exactly where it leads. Then comes the moment that the film treats almost as as a throwaway beat, and which almost no competing review spends any real time on, despite it being the single clearest, most concrete origin point for everything that eventually destroys Oppenheimer's career. Testifying before a congressional committee about the export of radioactive isotopes for medical research, a relatively minor bureaucratic matter, Oppenheimer is questioned by Lewis Strauss, then an AEC commissioner, who raises exaggerated concerns about the potential military misuse of isotopes. Oppenheimer's response is not measured or diplomatic. He delivers a devastatingly precise, faintly contemptuous rebuttal, comparing the isotopes to something as mundane and harmless as a shovel or a bottle of beer in terms of their weapons potential, and the hearing room laughs, openly, at Strauss's expense. Watch Robert Downey Jr.'s face in this scene rather than Cillian Murphy's, because this is Strauss's scene far more than it is Oppenheimer's. The humiliation registers instantly and completely. A proud, self-made man, sensitive about his lack of formal scientific education, publicly diminished by the one figure in Washington whose casual brilliance he has spent years quietly resenting. This is the entire hearing that eventually strips Oppenheimer of his security clearance beginning to take shape, not in some grand ideological conflict, but in a single unnecessary joke that cost Oppenheimer nothing in the moment and will eventually cost him everything. It is worth being precise about why this scene functions as the true origin point rather than any of the more commonly cited ideological disagreements between the two men. Political conflicts can be resolved through negotiation, compromise, mutual respect for differing positions argued in good faith. Public humiliation cannot be resolved that way. It does not fade with time the way a policy disagreement might. It calcifies, especially in a man who has spent his entire life fighting to be taken seriously despite lacking the formal academic pedigree of the scientists around him. Strauss does not simply disagree with Oppenheimer after this hearing. He is wounded by him, in front of witnesses, in a format that offers no opportunity for private reconciliation, and wounds delivered publicly demand. In the psychology this film keeps returning to again and again, a correspondingly public reckoning eventually. Notice how briefly this scene plays on screen, a few lines of dialogue, a single uncomfortable laugh, compared to the years of consequence it eventually produces. This is the exact same narrative technique the film used with the Szilard petition, burying its most consequential moment inside a scene so brief a distracted viewer might miss it entirely, because the film's real argument throughout is that the largest catastrophes rarely announce themselves as major turning points while they are actually happening. There is a moral dilemma worth raising directly to the audience here. Is it fair to hold a man responsible for a career-ending grudge formed over a joke he likely forgot within the hour, a grudge that took years to fully metastasize into a coordinated campaign involving forged documents, selectively leaked files, and a hearing process designed from the outset to reach a predetermined conclusion? On one hand, Oppenheimer said nothing untrue in that hearing room, and holding him responsible for another man's disproportionate reaction risks excusing Strauss's eventual conduct entirely. On the other hand, the film has spent 4 full acts establishing that Oppenheimer's casual cruelty toward people he considers beneath him intellectually is not an isolated incident, but a defining, recurring pattern, visible with Blackhead at Cambridge, with the students he swept aside at Berkeley, with Kitty at every dinner party where her competence went unacknowledged. Strauss is simply the first person in this pattern with enough institutional power to eventually make the cruelty cost something in return. It is worth pausing here to notice the precise psychological mechanism the film is diagnosing in Strauss, because it is, structurally, the exact same mechanism the film has been diagnosing in Oppenheimer since the very first act. Strauss cannot tolerate being diminished in a room. He has spent his career building a self-made identity, a shoe salesman turned financier turned government official, meticulously constructing a version of himself immune to the condescension he clearly expects from Ivy League scientists who look down on his lack of formal credentials. And in a single sentence, Oppenheimer confirms every insecurity Strauss has ever carried, delivered with an ease that makes the wound worse rather than better. This is the film's mirror finally clicking fully into focus. Two men, driven by the identical fear of being small, expressing that fear in opposite directions. Oppenheimer performing brilliance to be worshipped, Strauss accumulating institutional power to never again be laughed at. Neither man recognizes the other as a reflection of himself, and that failure of recognition on both sides is what makes the collision between them, still years away at this point in the story, feel less like a political conspiracy and more like an inevitability that was seeded the moment two proud, wounded men occupied the same small room. Would this entire story have unfolded differently if Oppenheimer had simply answered Strauss's question plainly, without the joke, without the audience laughter, without the small, satisfying performance of superiority he could not resist delivering? It is a genuinely open question and worth sitting with rather than dismissing, because the film is quietly arguing that history's largest injustices often trace back not to grand ideological battles, but to small, avoidable moments of unearned cruelty between people who might otherwise have simply coexisted. Strauss's insecurity about his lack of formal education is not incidental set dressing either. It recurs throughout the remainder of the film in the deliberate way he surrounds himself with academic credentials he cannot personally claim, in his sensitivity to any suggestion that scientists view men like him as mere administrators standing between real intellectual work and the government funding it requires. Oppenheimer, for his part, seems almost entirely unaware, in this moment and for years afterward, that he has made an enemy at all, precisely because making people feel small has never registered to him as a meaningful act, only as a reflexive, almost involuntary assertion of his own intelligence, the same reflex that poisoned an apple, that seduced and abandoned Jean Tatlock, that built a personality cult out of a physics lecture hall. Strauss will remember this hearing in granular detail for years. Oppenheimer, by every indication the film gives us, barely remembers it at all, and that asymmetry of memory, one man's minor victory becoming another man's permanent wound, is the exact mechanism that will eventually detonate his career with far more precision than any bomb he ever built. Robert Downey Jr.'s performance across this stretch deserves specific film criticism attention rather than generic praise, because he is doing something genuinely difficult, playing a man whose grievance the audience is meant to understand completely, while never once excusing where that grievance eventually leads him. Downey plays Strauss with a controlled, watchful stillness, rarely raising his voice, rarely showing his hand, a man who has learned that real power in Washington is exercised quietly, through memos and appointments and carefully cultivated relationships rather than public confrontation, and that stillness makes the eventual reveal of exactly how far his resentment has traveled all the more unsettling, because nothing about his outward demeanor in the years between this hearing and his eventual revenge would suggest a man capable of the campaign he is patiently constructing off-screen. Truman, facing pressure after the Soviet Union successfully tests its own atomic weapon far earlier than American intelligence predicted, overrules the General Advisory Committee's recommendation and authorizes a full hydrogen bomb program regardless. This is the second major open loop the film closes with total certainty this act, following the earlier Szilard petition, another formal, considered, expert objection raised and ultimately discarded once political and military momentum decides otherwise. Oppenheimer's authority, so carefully built across the post-war years, has just been tested against actual policy, and it has lost. He remains chairman of the committee, still publicly celebrated, still consulted, but the film wants you to register the shift precisely here. His influence from this point forward is largely ceremonial, tolerated rather than genuinely heated, a distinguished conscience the government is happy to display, but increasingly unwilling to actually follow. Hold that diminishment in mind, because a government growing comfortable ignoring a famous man's advice is not far removed, in the political climate about to engulf this story, from a government growing comfortable questioning whether that famous man should be trusted with any influence at all. There is a broader theme this act is quietly building toward the film's eventual argument about legacy, redemption, and power, three of the central preoccupations of the entire story. Oppenheimer's post-war years look, from the outside, like exactly the kind of second act a redemption narrative requires. A man who built a terrible weapon now devoting himself to responsible stewardship of the age he helped create. The film refuses to let that redemption arc complete on schedule, undercutting it first with the hydrogen bomb defeat, then, in the acts still ahead, with a far more direct and personal political assault. This refusal is not the film being needlessly cruel to its own protagonist. It is the film insisting that redemption cannot simply be self-declared through good intentions and public advocacy, that a man's private reckoning with what he built does not automatically translate into institutional forgiveness, especially once that man becomes politically inconvenient to the very government he is trying to advise responsibly. Compare Oppenheimer's diminishing influence here to Kitty's consistently ignored competence throughout the earlier acts of the film, both figures possessing genuine insight that increasingly powerful men around them find easier to overrule than to seriously engage with, a pattern the film has now shown you operating at the scale of a marriage and, in this act, at the scale of national policy. Hold on to the specific sequence of defeats this act has stacked up. The Szilard petition buried, not Nagasaki proceeding regardless, the hydrogen bomb approved over formal expert objection, and a personal humiliation delivered to a man who will soon hold Oppenheimer's entire career in his hands. None of these defeats individually looks catastrophic. Taken together, they form the complete architecture of the collapse still ahead. A man whose expert judgment is repeatedly overruled by political momentum, and whose casual disregard for the feelings of a less brilliant but far more patient rival has quietly armed that rival with exactly the motivation he will need to finish the job. The film is done building. Everything from this point forward is the machinery it has spent 5 acts assembling finally beginning to move. Some viewers will finish this stretch of the film feeling real sympathy for Strauss, a talented, self-made man denied the respect he earned through a lifetime of genuine institutional achievement, humiliated in public by a man who never had to fight for a fraction of the credibility Strauss built from nothing. Others will feel that any sympathy for Strauss evaporates the moment his private wound curdles into a public campaign built on selective evidence and manufactured suspicion. Both reactions are worth holding on to simultaneously as we move into the years where that campaign finally takes shape, because a story built entirely around a villain is far less unsettling than one built around 2 flawed, wounded, entirely human men, each convinced the other represents everything wrong with how power and respect get distributed in America. The political climate around Oppenheimer shifts faster than his own sense of his standing does, and the film tracks this shift through the rising temperature of American anti-communist paranoia, McCarthyism metastasizing from a fringe political tactic into something close to national policy, and a security apparatus increasingly hostile to precisely the kind of ambiguous, left-adjacent past Oppenheimer has carried, mostly unexamined, since his Berkeley years. What once seemed like the forgivable idealism of a brilliant young academic, fundraising for Spanish Civil War relief, a brother in the Communist Party, friendships inside left-wing intellectual circles, now reads, in this new political climate, as exactly the kind of pattern security officials are trained to treat as evidence of divided loyalty. The film does not ask you to believe Oppenheimer was ever a genuine security threat, and offers no evidence that he was. It asks you to watch how quickly a set of facts that meant one thing in 1936 can be re-narrated to mean something entirely different in 1953, without a single new fact actually being added to the record, simply a change in the political weather surrounding an unchanged set of associations from decades earlier. This is worth dwelling on because it is the clearest possible illustration of a theme the film has been building since its opening frames. The instability of narrative itself, how the exact same set of facts can be assembled into a heroic story or a treasonous one, depending entirely on who is doing the assembling and what political moment they are assembling it for. During the war, Oppenheimer's left-wing associations were treated as a manageable risk against an urgent, overriding necessity. Groves personally vouched for him despite security officers' objections, because winning the race against Germany mattered more than perfect ideological purity in the man leading the effort. Now, with the war a decade gone and a new enemy, international communism rather than fascism, defining the nation's anxieties, those same associations are reread through an entirely different lens, and nobody needs to prove Oppenheimer did anything differently in the intervening years. They only need to convince a hearing board that the story surrounding a fixed set of facts should now be told differently, which is precisely the kind of narrative manipulation the film itself has been quietly warning you to watch for since its very first act, structured as it is around one man's self-serving memory of his own life. There is a broader comparative point worth raising here, because this specific mechanism, an entire life re-narrated as evidence of disloyalty once political usefulness expires, was not unique to Oppenheimer. The same era produced dozens of quieter, less famous versions of this exact story, academics, artists, and civil servants whose past associations, once tolerated or entirely unremarkable, became career-ending liabilities the moment the political wind shifted. Oppenheimer's case became the most visible of these stories primarily because of his fame, not because his situation was unusual, and the film's decision to center his particular downfall functions almost as a synecdoche for an entire climate of American life during this period. A warning about how quickly a society's tolerance for past political affiliation can evaporate once fear becomes the dominant currency of public life. Watching this unfold with the benefit of historical distance, it is tempting to treat it as a uniquely dramatic episode belonging to one man's biography. The film wants you to recognize it instead as a pattern, one that has repeated across different eras and different targets, and one the audience should remain alert to recognizing again. Consider, too, 2. How this act quietly reframes something established as early as the first act of the film. Oppenheimer's own compartmentalized personal history. The Chevalier incident, his hesitation to immediately report an attempted approach for Soviet intelligence, was treated at the time as a minor lapse in judgment, quickly disclosed, apparently resolved. In this new political climate, that same hesitation becomes Exhibit A in an argument about his fundamental untrustworthiness, evidence not of an isolated error but of a deeper, more troubling pattern of divided loyalty. The film does not ask you to decide definitively whether this reframing is fair or unfair. It asks you to notice how completely the meaning of a fixed historical fact can be rewritten simply by changing the surrounding narrative, the exact vulnerability every person's past carries, regardless of how honestly it was originally handled. Lewis Strauss, meanwhile, has spent the years since the Isotope hearing consolidating exactly the kind of institutional position that turns a personal grudge into an executable plan. Appointed chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, Strauss now sits at the exact intersection of nuclear policy and national security clearance decisions, a position that hands him direct, formal authority over the one thing that could genuinely end Robert Oppenheimer's career, and the film lets you watch him settle into that authority with the patient, unhurried satisfaction of a man who has waited a long time for precisely this leverage. Notice that Strauss never needs to fabricate new evidence against Oppenheimer. Everything eventually used against him already exists in decades-old files. The Chevalier incident, the Tatlock relationship, Frank Oppenheimer's Communist Party membership, all of it previously reviewed, previously cleared, previously judged insufficient to disqualify him from the highest levels of nuclear secrecy during the war itself. What changes is not the evidence. What changes is who controls how that evidence gets framed, and Strauss, for the first time in this entire story, finally holds exactly the kind of unambiguous institutional power Oppenheimer has always taken for granted. There is a specific kind of patience on display in Strauss's climb to this position that deserves recognition as its own form of craft, separate from, and in some ways more unsettling than Oppenheimer's flashier brilliance. Where Oppenheimer's power has always been immediate, dazzling, visible the instant he enters a room, Strauss's power has been accumulated slowly, invisibly, through appointments and relationships and careful institutional positioning that produces no dramatic moment worth remembering until the exact instant it finally pays off. The film asks you to consider which kind of ambition is actually more dangerous: the loud, undisciplined hunger for admiration that built and detonated a bomb, or the quiet, disciplined hunger for vindication that spent years patiently waiting for the single moment it could finally matter. Both men wanted, more than anything else, to never again feel small in a room. One of them achieved that feeling through spectacular, world historical achievement. The other is about to achieve it through the quiet, procedural destruction of the man who made him feel that way in the first place. And the film does not appear to consider either method more or less legitimate than the other, only more or less visible to history. There is also a specific irony in Strauss occupying the AEC chairmanship at all, a body originally conceived to ensure civilian, scientifically informed oversight of nuclear policy, now headed by a man whose primary qualification is institutional loyalty and administrative cunning rather than any scientific expertise whatsoever. The film lets this irony sit without underlining it too heavily, trusting the audience to notice that the very structure meant to keep nuclear policy insulated from purely political maneuvering has, through entirely legal appointments and entirely ordinary bureaucratic process, ended up delivering exactly the opposite outcome. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic, cinematic sense of secret meetings and coded messages. It is simply how institutions function when the people who care most about being right are less patient and less politically skilled than the people who care most about winning. Would you have recognized Strauss's threat coming if you were Oppenheimer, watching him rise through these appointments over the years without ever fully registering the wound underneath his composed exterior? The film seems to suggest almost certainly not, and not simply because Oppenheimer is inattentive, but because the entire psychological architecture that makes him brilliant, the ability to file away discomfort and keep moving forward, is precisely the architecture that prevents him from ever taking Strauss's resentment seriously enough to manage it. A more socially attentive man might have made amends, offered a private apology, done something to defuse a grudge he probably never fully registered as a grudge in the first place. Oppenheimer simply moves on, the same way he moved on from the poisoned apple, from Gene Tatlock's exhaustion, from every wound he has ever inflicted without quite recognizing it as a wound. And Strauss's rise to the AEC chairmanship is the direct, uninterrupted continuation of a debt Oppenheimer Oppenheimer never knew he owed. The specific instrument of the attack arrives through William Borden, a congressional staffer whose obsessive suspicion of Oppenheimer culminates in a letter to the FBI alleging, without new evidence, that Oppenheimer is more probably than not an actual agent of the Soviet Union. This letter, built almost entirely from selective reinterpretation of information the government has possessed and cleared for years, lands on the desk of an Eisenhower administration eager to appear tough on internal security, and the response is immediate and severe. Oppenheimer's security clearance is suspended, and a formal hearing is convened to determine whether it should be permanently revoked. Watch how quickly the machinery moves once it starts, compared to the years of slow-building resentment that preceded it. This is the film's argument about institutional power completing itself. Individual grievances accumulate quietly, sometimes for a decade or more, and then, once the right lever of formal authority is finally in the right hands, the actual execution takes only weeks. Borden himself is worth pausing on, because he is not simply a tool wielded by Strauss. The film suggests his suspicion of Oppenheimer is genuinely, independently held, a true believer's conviction rather than a hired hand's fabrication, and that distinction matters enormously to how the entire hearing should be understood. This was never purely a conspiracy manufactured by a single vengeful man. It was a convergence, an ambitious bureaucrat with a decade-old grudge finding his moment precisely when a broader political climate of genuine, widespread anti-communist anxiety made an already written letter suddenly land with maximum institutional force. Remove Strauss from this story entirely, and Borden's letter might still have caused damage, simply through the era's prevailing paranoia. Remove Borden, and Strauss might have needed to wait for some other pretext to arrive. The film's argument is not that one villain destroyed Robert Oppenheimer. It is that an entire system, primed by fear, personal resentment, and institutional opportunity all converging at the same historical moment, produced an outcome that no single actor needed to fully orchestrate alone. Notice, too, how the film chooses to depict Borden's motivations without ever caricaturing him as a cartoonish zealot. He is shown as meticulous, methodical, genuinely convinced by patterns he has assembled from publicly available and classified information alike. A man who believes he is protecting his country rather than settling a personal score. This matters because it forecloses the easiest, most comforting reading of the entire hearing, that a single obviously bad actor engineered an obviously unjust outcome. The film instead insists on a harder truth. Reasonable-seeming people, following procedures that look legitimate on paper, are entirely capable of producing a profoundly unjust result, especially when the underlying evidence is ambiguous enough to be read multiple ways and the political incentive to read it uncharitably is strong enough to tip the interpretation. There is a comparative point worth raising here to films and dramatizations built around a single clear villain, something closer to a conventional political thriller where evil is legible, motivated, and ultimately defeatable through sufficient courage or cleverness from the protagonist. This film consistently refuses that structure. Every antagonist force, Strauss, Borden, the broader anti-communist political apparatus, is shown operating through processes that feel procedurally legitimate even when their outcome is unjust, and that refusal to simplify is part of what makes the eventual hearing so much more unsettling than a conventional courtroom drama. There is no single lie to expose, no single villain to unmask, only a system working exactly as its individual components, each reasonable in isolation, allow it to. Oppenheimer is blindsided, and the film lets his shock register as genuine rather than performative, because on some level he has spent his entire post-war life believing his fame and his wartime contribution had purchased him a kind of permanent institutional protection, the same forgiveness the government extended to his ambiguous political past back when his usefulness was undeniable. What he has failed to fully register, despite every warning sign the film has carefully planted since the Truman meeting, is that the transactional bargain underlying his entire relationship with government power was never permanent. It was conditional, renewed only as long as he remained useful, and a man increasingly associated in the public eye with doubt, restraint, and opposition to weapons expansion has become, in the political climate of 1954, something closer to a liability than an asset. He hires a lawyer, prepares a defense, and agrees to the hearing rather than simply resigning quietly, and the film frames this choice as both understandable and, in hindsight, catastrophic, because the hearing that follows is not designed as a fair evaluation of the evidence. It is designed, procedurally and psychologically, to produce exactly one outcome. Ask yourself what you would have done in his position, faced with a choice between quietly resigning and preserving some measure of private dignity, or fighting a rigged process process publicly in hopes of vindicating a reputation you genuinely believe you deserve to keep. Oppenheimer chooses to fight, and the film neither celebrates nor condemns that choice outright, though it makes clear, in retrospect, how badly it will cost him. There is a version of pride here that is almost sympathetic, a refusal to simply disappear quietly after everything he built and sacrificed. And there is a version of the same pride that is recognizably the same flaw the film has tracked since Cambridge, an inability to accept diminishment without a fight, even when the fight itself is unwinnable by design. Kitty, notably, urges a more cautious legal strategy from the outset, understanding the procedural trap more clearly than her husband does, and once again, as in every earlier instance the film has carefully built toward this moment, her clearer judgment is heard, acknowledged, and ultimately overridden by a man who has never fully learned to treat her counsel as equal to his own instincts. There is a deeper character psychology worth surfacing in why Oppenheimer chooses to fight rather than quietly resign, beyond simple pride. Throughout this entire film, his sense of self has been inseparable from being seen by students, by colleagues, by Groves, by the entire nation after Trinity, as uniquely capable, uniquely necessary, uniquely deserving of trust with the largest secrets and the highest stakes. A quiet resignation would allow the government to simply move on without ever fully confirming or denying his loyalty, an ambiguous ending that, for most people, might be preferable to public humiliation. For Oppenheimer specifically, ambiguity itself may be more unbearable than a definitive, damning verdict, because ambiguity denies him the one thing he has never learned to live without: a room's full, undivided verdict on exactly who he is. Some viewers will find this decision admirable, a refusal to let an unjust system win by default, a man standing on principle even when the odds are overwhelmingly against him. Others will see something closer to a final, tragic act of the same self-destructive pride that has shaped every major decision across this entire film, a man walking willingly into a process he could have avoided, driven by the same need to be publicly vindicated that once needed a lecture hall full of devoted students and a nation's grateful applause. Both readings deserve serious consideration rather than a quick verdict, because the film itself refuses to resolve which motivation is truly dominant, allowing pride and integrity to remain tangled together right up until the moment the hearing room doors finally close behind him. Before the hearing itself begins, it is worth pausing on the specific unfairness the film takes real care to document, because it is easy to lose inside the emotional drama of the testimony that follows. Oppenheimer's own defense attorneys are denied full security clearance to review the classified evidence being used against their client, a fundamental due process failure that would be unthinkable in an actual criminal proceeding. The hearing itself is not a court of law and offers none of the formal protections one would normally assume in a proceeding that could end a man's career and reputation permanently. It is, in every functional sense, a closed-door administrative review structured to look like a fair hearing while denying the accused nearly every meaningful tool of self-defense. Hold this structural imbalance in mind as we move into the testimony itself, because the film wants you to understand, going in, that whatever verdict eventually emerges was never really in doubt from the moment Strauss decided to convene this process at all. Compare this structural imbalance to how a courtroom drama typically builds tension, usually through the possibility, however remote, that justice might actually prevail if the defense simply argues well enough. This film denies its audience that hope almost entirely, and the denial is deliberate, a director refusing to let a rigged system masquerade as a fair contest simply because the eventual testimony will feel dramatic and high stakes. Roger Robb, the prosecuting counsel brought in specifically for this hearing, will have access to material Oppenheimer's own lawyers cannot see, will be permitted lines of questioning about deeply personal matters that have no bearing on any legitimate security concern, and will conduct the entire proceeding with the confidence of a man who understands, correctly, that he does not need to win the argument on its merits because the outcome was effectively decided before the first witness was ever called. Hold this in mind as an open loop we will not close until this act's counterpart later in the story. Strauss himself will eventually face a hearing of his own before the United States Senate, and the film is quietly setting up a structural rhyme between these two proceedings, one entirely private, hidden from public view, stacked against the accused from the outset, the other conducted in full public view, with consequences Strauss will not be able to control nearly as completely as he controls this one. Whether that later hearing offers anything resembling justice for what happens to Oppenheimer here is a question worth carrying forward through everything that follows, because the film's ending depends entirely on how you answer answer it. There is one final piece of context worth carrying into the testimony that follows, a fact the film treats almost in passing, but which reframes everything about how this hearing should be understood. The three-person panel deciding Oppenheimer's fate is not a jury of impartial peers. It includes men with their own institutional stakes in the outcome, some sympathetic to the case against him before a single word of testimony has been heard, and the chairman of the board has already been quietly informed, through back channels, of the administration's preferred outcome. This is not a courtroom in any meaningful sense. It is theater, dressed in the language and procedure of due process, staged specifically to produce a result that has already been substantially agreed upon by the people with the actual power to decide it, and everything that happens across the following days of testimony should be understood inside that frame. The hearing room itself is small, deliberately unceremonious, nothing like the grandeur of a courtroom, and the film uses that smallness to its advantage, letting the walls feel closer with every session, the space itself becoming a kind of pressure chamber the longer Oppenheimer sits inside it. Roger Robb, the government's counsel, opens not with the substantive question of loyalty, but with a procedural maneuver that sets the tone for everything to follow. He has read Oppenheimer's most private security files, including years of wiretap conversations Oppenheimer himself has never seen, and he uses that asymmetry immediately, asking pointed, specific questions clearly designed to catch Oppenheimer in contradictions with statements Robb already knows the exact wording of statements. Oppenheimer is being asked to recall from memory without ever having had the chance to review them himself. Watch how quickly this reduces a man once celebrated for the sharpest mind in the room to something closer to a defendant fumbling for consistency, not because his memory is unreliable, but because he is being tested against a version of his own past he has no access to, an asymmetry the film wants you to feel as almost physically disorienting. There is a specific craft choice worth naming in how Nolan shoots these early hearing sequences, tighter and more static than almost anything else in the film. None of the sweeping desert vistas of Los Alamos, none of the kinetic energy of the Berkeley lecture scenes, just close, fixed compositions of men in suits asking questions in a windowless room. This visual austerity matters because it strips away every environmental advantage Oppenheimer has relied on throughout his life to project authority. There is no lecture hall full of admiring students here, no secret city built to his specifications, no desert stretching wide enough to match his self-image. There is only a small table, a hostile questioner, and a stenographer recording every word for a permanent record he will never fully control. Compare this visual claustrophobia to the earlier widening of the frame at Los Alamos, and the contrast becomes the entire emotional argument of the act without a single line of dialogue needing to state it directly. The room has finally shrunk down to match the size of the man's actual accountability, rather than the size of his myth. There is also a specific temporal disorientation Nolan builds into these hearing scenes worth naming directly, because the film cuts between this hearing and the parallel black and white Strauss confirmation timeline with increasing frequency as the story progresses, and the effect is to make the audience feel, almost physically, the way Oppenheimer's fate is being decided by forces operating in rooms he cannot see, on a timeline he does not control, by people whose full motivations he will not fully understand until much later, if ever. This structural choice mirrors the epistemic position the audience has occupied since the very beginning of the film, watching one man's subjective, self-justifying memory while a colder, external, more skeptical account runs in parallel, always slightly ahead of what the subjective version is willing to admit. By this point in the story, the two timelines are close enough to touching that the audience should be actively anticipating the moment they finally fully collide. Watch, too, how Nolan withholds color from the Strauss timeline specifically to make this exact contrast legible without narration. Everything Oppenheimer experiences, we experience through his own remembered, subjective, saturated color palette. Even the humiliation of this hearing rendered with a kind of intimate, painful vividness. Strauss's world, by contrast, exists in a colder, more distanced black and white, an external, more clinical register that suggests objectivity even though it too, eventually, proves to be its own kind of subjective, self-serving account. This formal choice is not simply an aesthetic flourish. It is the film's argument about memory and history made visible. Neither version of events, the vivid subjective one or the cold objective one, is fully trustworthy on its own, and the audience's task across the remainder of the film is to hold both accounts simultaneously, refusing the comfort of a single, uncomplicated narrator. Then comes the Chevalier incident, dragged back into the light after more than a decade, and Robb pursues it with a precision clearly designed to to expose every inconsistency in how Oppenheimer explained it at the time versus how he explains it now. Oppenheimer, under pressure, admits he lied to a security officer in 1943 about the exact nature of Chevalier's approach, inventing an intermediary, a fictional cover story meant to protect a friend without fully implicating him, and Rob seizes on the admission with obvious practice satisfaction. This is where the film's earlier decision to include the actual Chevalier conversation at Berkeley, offhand and easy to miss in the moment it happened, pays its full narrative dividend. The audience already knows Oppenheimer's underlying loyalty was never genuinely in question. What the hearing reveals instead is something more specific and, in its own way, more damning. A man who lied not out of disloyalty, but out of the same instinct for control and narrative management that has defined nearly every important choice of his life, reshaping an inconvenient truth just enough to protect the story he needed to be true, and now being asked, a decade later, to account for exactly the kind of narrative construction the film itself has spent its entire runtime warning you to watch for. Is a well-intentioned lie still a lie deserving of professional destruction, or does context, motive, and the passage of time earn a person some measure of forgiveness for a single moment of poor judgment made under extraordinary wartime pressure? This is a genuine moral dilemma the film refuses to resolve cleanly, because both readings carry real weight. Oppenheimer's fabrication protected a friend from an accusation that likely would have ended his career, even though Chevalier never actually succeeded in extracting anything from him. And a stricter, less forgiving reading of loyalty might argue that even a protective lie to a security officer represents exactly the kind of divided allegiance a security clearance process exists to catch. What the film makes unmistakably clear is that Rob does not care about resolving this dilemma with any nuance. He cares only about establishing, on the record, that Robert Oppenheimer is a man capable of lying to government officials when it suits his own private calculations, a fact that, once established, can be applied retroactively to cast doubt on virtually every other claim he has ever made about his own loyalty and intentions. Compare this moment to the film's very first act, where a young Oppenheimer poisons an apple and is quietly rescued from consequences through family intervention and a psychiatric consultation nobody outside his immediate circle ever fully learns about. There, the story allowed him a private reckoning with no lasting public cost. Here, an equally human, equally understandable lapse in judgment, protecting a friend through a small fabrication rather than attempting to poison a professor out of humiliated rage, receives no such mercy, dissected instead in exhaustive, public, permanently recorded detail. The disproportion between these two moments is not an inconsistency in the writing. It is the entire argument the final act of this film is building toward. The same institutions that quietly protected Robert Oppenheimer through every earlier failure of judgment, when protecting him served their interests, now abandon that same discretion entirely the moment protecting him no longer serves anyone's interests but his own. There is also a specific irony worth naming in exactly what the hearing punishes. Oppenheimer is not being asked to answer for building a weapon that killed well over 100,000 civilians, a decision the film has spent multiple acts complicating and interrogating from every possible angle. He is being asked to answer for a small, protective lie told to a security officer more than a decade earlier, a decision with genuinely minor real-world consequence compared to everything else this story has held him accountable for. The disproportion between the scale of the actual harm this man participated in and the scale of the offense actually being litigated in this room is, itself, one of the film's sharpest and least commented upon observations. American institutions in this era proved far more capable of rigorously punishing a private, forgivable deception than they ever proved capable of seriously reckoning with the public. World-altering consequences of the weapon this same man delivered without hesitation less than a decade before. Gene Tatlock's name enters the hearing room next, and this is where the proceeding stops resembling a security review altogether and becomes something closer to a public autopsy of a dead woman's private life. Rob presses Oppenheimer on the exact timeline of a late-night visit to Tatlock's apartment years earlier, during the height of wartime security restrictions, a visit government agents had under surveillance, and which Oppenheimer must now describe in humiliating, granular detail in front of a panel and a stenographer. Watch how the film frames this specific stretch of testimony, not as scandal for its own sake, but as the exact mechanism by which institutional power converts a person's most private grief and longing into a weapon. Tatlock had died by suicide years before this hearing, and Oppenheimer is forced to relive the final months of a relationship already saturated saturated with guilt, in a room built to extract confession rather than offer any space for genuine mourning. And the film lets Cillian Murphy's face carry the full, silent weight of grief being repurposed as evidence. This sequence deserves to be named as one of the sharpest pieces of feminist critique embedded anywhere in the film, even though it arrives disguised as a scene ostensibly about Oppenheimer's own suffering. Jean Tatlock, who was never given the narrative space in earlier acts to be fully understood on her own terms, is now denied even the dignity of being left alone in death, her private despair and her private relationship reduced to a security question, a data point in an argument about a man's fitness for government trust that has nothing whatsoever to do with who she actually was or what she actually believed. The film does not attempt to correct this injustice by suddenly granting Tatlock more interiority in flashback. It leaves the injustice fully intact, because correcting it now, retroactively, would let the audience off the hook too easily, offering a comforting resolution to a wound the film wants you to feel remains genuinely, permanently unresolved. Some viewers may find this frustrating, a missed opportunity to finally give a marginalized character her due. A more generous reading recognizes that the frustration itself is the point, a formal choice mirroring exactly how completely this hearing, and by extension this entire historical episode, subordinated a woman's memory to a man's political fate without ever pretending otherwise. There is a broader thematic thread this scene connects to as well, one the film has been tracking since Kitty's introduction. The specific, gendered cost women in this story pay for proximity to Robert Oppenheimer's genius, a cost he himself rarely, if ever, has to consciously reckon with. Tatlock loved a man who could not be fully present. Kitty married a man who could not treat her as an equal partner in his decisions. Both women's private struggles are now, in this hearing, being converted into evidence in a case that is fundamentally about protecting or ending the career of the man who never fully saw either of their struggles clearly while they were alive to voice them. The hearing does not invent this dynamic. It simply exposes, under harsh institutional light, a pattern that has been quietly operating throughout the entire film and forces the audience to watch it play out one final, devastating time. Some viewers may ask why the film does not simply cut away from this material entirely, sparing both Oppenheimer and Tatlock's memory the indignity of this exposure. The more compelling answer is that flinching away would let the audience off the hook exactly the way the era itself refused to let Oppenheimer off the hook, sanitizing an ugliness that was, historically, an actual and undeniable part of how this specific process unfolded. A film willing to dramatize the physical horror of Trinity in unflinching detail owes its audience the same unflinching honesty about the quieter, more intimate horrors this hearing inflicted, even when, especially when, that honesty implicates the very government the protagonist spent his career serving. Notice how thoroughly this hearing inverts the emotional architecture of the entire film so far. For 6 acts, Oppenheimer has been the person controlling the room, the brilliant mind everyone else adjusts themselves around, the man whose narrative of his own life the audience has been trusted to follow. Here, for the first time, someone else controls the pacing, the framing, the selective emphasis of which facts matter and which do not, and Rob performs this control with the same casual confidence Oppenheimer once used to dominate a Berkeley lecture hall. This is the film's mirror structure completing itself with brutal irony. The exact skill of narrative control that made Oppenheimer so effective, so charismatic, so impossible to say no to throughout his entire career, is now being used against him by a man who understands that skill just as well and has spent weeks preparing to exploit it. Rob is not simply prosecuting Oppenheimer's loyalty. He is dismantling the myth Oppenheimer built of himself, fact by selectively chosen fact, in the exact same patient, methodical way Oppenheimer once built that myth in the first place. There is a specific piece of film criticism worth applying to Jason Clarke's performance as Rob here, because the temptation in a role like this is to play the prosecutor as an obvious villain, sneering and openly malicious. Clarke resists that temptation almost entirely, playing Rob instead as calm, professional, even courteous in tone, a man who appears to genuinely believe he is simply doing rigorous, necessary work in service of national security. That restraint makes the character far more unsettling than open villainy would have, because it forces the audience to reckon with an uncomfortable truth the film keeps circling back to throughout its final stretch. Institutional cruelty rarely requires a cruel person to execute it. It only requires someone skilled, thorough, and entirely convinced of the righteousness of the process they have been asked to carry out, regardless of how devastating its actual human cost turns out to be for the person sitting across the table from them. Compare Rob's method here to the isotope hearing humiliation humiliation from 2 acts earlier, where Oppenheimer used precisely worded intelligence and a well-timed joke to dismantle Strauss in front of witnesses. Rob is doing structurally the same thing now, using precise information and expertly timed questions to dismantle Oppenheimer in front of a panel, except Rob has an advantage Oppenheimer never had in that earlier hearing: full access to his opponent's private history, obtained through wiretaps and confidential files Oppenheimer's side is never permitted to review. The rhyme between these two scenes is not accidental. It is the film's clearest possible statement about the entire second half of the story. The tools of humiliation are the same tools regardless of who wields them: precision, information asymmetry, and the willingness to use both without mercy. And the only real difference between the two hearings is which side happens to be holding the sharper weapon on any given day. This rhyme also completes an argument the film has been quietly constructing about power itself. That power in this story is never really about being right, or even about being loyal in any meaningful sense. It is about controlling the room, controlling the information, controlling which facts get amplified and which get buried, and whoever holds that control at any given moment can produce whatever verdict best serves their interests, regardless of the underlying truth. Oppenheimer held that control for most of this story. He does not hold it now, and the film wants you to feel exactly how quickly a person's entire public identity can be rewritten once someone else finally gains the leverage to do the rewriting. Kitty watches most of this from outside the hearing room, denied the ability to be present for testimony that will decide her family's entire future, and the film returns briefly to her isolation here, a callback to every earlier moment she was excluded from rooms where decisions about her own life were being made without her input. Colleagues Oppenheimer once considered friends begin arriving to testify, some supportive, most cautiously neutral, a few openly hostile, and the film lets you feel the specific loneliness of watching a professional community, built over decades of shared brilliance and shared secrecy, quietly recalculating how much personal risk they are each willing to accept in order to stand behind him publicly. Some choose loyalty, most choose self-preservation. The film does not condemn the ones who hesitate, understanding, with real clarity, exactly how dangerous public association with a man now formally suspected of disloyalty has become in this specific political climate. Hold this fracturing community in mind, because the next act will bring the single most devastating betrayal of the entire film, delivered not by an enemy, but by a man Oppenheimer once considered close enough to indulge, protect, and mentor through years of professional frustration. Would you have testified on his behalf, knowing the political risk of public association with a man now formally suspected of disloyalty, at a moment in American history when that association alone could end your own career regardless of your actual beliefs or actual knowledge of any wrongdoing? This is not a comfortable question, and the film does not let the audience answer it from a position of easy moral superiority, because the entire climate surrounding this hearing was built specifically to make courage expensive and self-preservation rational. Notice how the film distributes blame here with real precision, refusing to simply condemn every hesitant colleague as a coward, while also refusing to pretend their hesitation was costless or without consequence for Oppenheimer. This is a community fracturing under exactly the kind of pressure the film has spent 6 acts building toward: individual, defensible choices accumulating into a collective abandonment that no single person fully intends and everyone, collectively, allows to happen anyway. There is one figure worth naming here specifically because his absence from open, public support becomes so consequential in the act still ahead. Edward Teller, the man whose fusion ambitions Oppenheimer once indulged and tolerated at Los Alamos, whose position on the hydrogen bomb Oppenheimer publicly opposed, has been asked to testify, and unlike most of the hesitant, cautiously neutral colleagues gathering in this act, Teller's testimony is not going to be neutral at all. Hold his name in your memory as this act closes, because what he says under oath in the hearing still to come will not simply be one more instance of quiet self-preservation. It will be the single most personally devastating betrayal Robert Oppenheimer experiences anywhere in this entire film, delivered by a man he spent years protecting from the consequences of his own disruptive, self-serving ambition. Ask yourself, as this act closes, whether loyalty built on years of shared professional history should be expected to survive a moment when speaking honestly could cost the speaker their own career and reputation. It is an easy question to answer confidently from the outside, watching decades later with no personal stake in the outcome. It was, evidently, a much harder question for the people actually living inside this specific, fear-saturated moment of American history, and the film is about to show you, in unsparing detail, exactly how one of Oppenheimer's closest professional relationships answers it. Edward Teller is called to testify, and everyone in the room, including Oppenheimer, expects some version of professional disagreement stated with professional restraint, the kind of measured criticism colleagues who have clashed over policy for years might reasonably offer about each other without crossing into personal condemnation. What Teller delivers instead is calibrated, deliberate, and devastating. Asked directly whether he considers Oppenheimer a security risk, Teller does not simply decline to defend him. He states, in careful, precise language clearly rehearsed in advance, that he would feel personally more secure if the country's most sensitive atomic affairs rested in hands other than Oppenheimer's, a sentence that manages to avoid an outright accusation of disloyalty while accomplishing exactly the same practical damage. Delivered by a witness with more scientific standing to make the accusation land than almost anyone else in the country. Watch Oppenheimer's face in the exact instant this sentence is spoken. This is not the reaction of a man absorbing an expected blow. This is the reaction of a man watching in real time. One of the last remaining pillars of his professional identity collapse from a direction he never fully prepared himself to defend against. Consider the specific cruelty of the phrasing Teller chooses, because it is worth examining as a piece of language rather than simply as plot information. He does not say Oppenheimer is disloyal. He does not accuse him of espionage or communist sympathy or any concrete wrongdoing at all. He says only that he would feel more secure with someone else holding the responsibility, a sentence built almost entirely out of Teller's own feelings rather than any factual claim about Oppenheimer's conduct, which makes it nearly impossible to rebut through evidence or argument. You cannot disprove another man's stated feeling of insecurity. This is precisely why the sentence proves so devastating and so difficult to counter in real time. It weaponizes the language of personal vulnerability while functioning, in practice, exactly like a formal accusation, giving the hearing panel everything they need to reach the conclusion they were already inclined toward. Delivered by a witness whose scientific credentials make his subjective feeling carry the weight of expert testimony. Compare this to how Oppenheimer himself once wielded language as a weapon, the isotope hearing years earlier, where a single, precisely aimed comparison to a shovel or a bottle of beer reduced Strauss to a laughingstock in front of an entire room. That earlier moment and this one are constructed from the exact same material, wit deployed with surgical precision to produce maximum humiliation with minimum apparent effort, and the film wants you to notice that Oppenheimer is now on the receiving end of a technique he himself perfected and used without a second thought when the target was someone he considered his intellectual inferior. Teller is not his intellectual inferior. Teller is, in fact, exactly the kind of formidable, credentialed peer whose words carry real institutional weight, which makes this particular use of the same weapon far more effective and far more painful than anything Strauss himself was ever capable of inflicting directly. There is also a specific dramatic irony in the fact that Oppenheimer indulged Teller's disruptive ambitions at Los Alamos precisely because he could not say no to a brilliant mind demanding attention, the same character flaw the film identified explicitly as early as the second act. Had Oppenheimer been a more disciplined administrator, less susceptible to flattering himself by tolerating difficult genius, he might have managed Teller differently, might never have given him the space and latitude that allowed his resentment and ambition to grow unchecked for over a decade. This is not to suggest Oppenheimer somehow deserves this betrayal. It is to notice, one final time, how completely the film's structure rewards close attention. The flaw introduced in a Berkeley lecture hall becomes the exact vulnerability that, years later, in a completely different context, produces the single most devastating consequence of the entire story. This is the moment to name directly what the entire film has been building toward since the Los Alamos recruitment sequence. The single lowest point of Robert Oppenheimer's psychological collapse. The moment where hope does not simply diminish but appears to vanish entirely. This is not a physical low point, no injury, no external catastrophe. It is the collapse of a belief he has carried, largely unexamined, since childhood, the belief that brilliance, properly demonstrated, will always eventually be recognized, rewarded, and protected by the people around him. Teller's testimony does not simply cost Oppenheimer his security clearance. It costs him the foundational assumption his entire identity was built on. The assumption that being the smartest, most necessary person in the room guarantees a kind of permanent belonging that ordinary rules and ordinary consequences do not fully apply to. Every earlier crisis in this story, Cambridge, Jean Tatlock, the Chevalier lie, was survivable because that assumption remained intact underneath it. Here, delivered by a man he personally protected and indulged for years despite repeated repeated warnings from colleagues about Teller's disruptive ambition, the assumption itself is what finally breaks. Trace this belief all the way back to its origin, because the film has been laying the groundwork for exactly this collapse since its opening minutes. At Cambridge, a humiliated Oppenheimer poisons an apple rather than accept that his intelligence alone might not be sufficient to command a room's respect, and the film quietly rescues him from consequence, allowing the belief that brilliance excuses everything to survive fully intact. At Berkeley, the same belief lets him build a personality cult out of a lecture hall, mistaking devotion for genuine connection. At Los Alamos, the belief becomes literal government policy, an entire nation deciding his usefulness outweighs every legitimate security concern raised against him. Even his marriage to Kitty and his failure to ever fully treat her insight as equal to his own is built on a version of this same belief that his own perception and judgment are simply more valuable than anyone else's in the room, hers included. Every one of these earlier moments functioned as evidence, in Oppenheimer's own mind, that the belief was true, that genius really does purchase a permanent exemption from ordinary consequences. Teller's testimony is the first moment in the entire story where that evidence is definitively, irreversibly contradicted, and the contradiction does not simply disappoint him. It dismantles the entire internal architecture he has used to make sense of his own life since he was a young man alone in a Cambridge laboratory. There is a final piece of dramatic irony worth surfacing here, one that sharpens the tragedy considerably. Teller's own psychology, obsessive, insecure, desperate to be recognized as the architect of the next great weapon rather than a supporting player in Oppenheimer's greater triumph, is itself a mirror of the exact insecurity that has driven Oppenheimer since childhood. Teller does not betray Oppenheimer because he is fundamentally different from him. He betrays him because he is, in the specific ways that matter most here, disturbingly similar. A man who has also spent his career needing to be seen as singularly essential, and who has finally found, in this hearing, an opportunity to step out from under a shadow he has resented for years. The film is not simply showing you one man's downfall. It is showing you how the same underlying hunger for recognition can express itself as either genius or betrayal, depending entirely on which direction circumstance happens to point it. This is, finally, the film's fullest articulation of its central thesis, the one this entire review has been arguing since the opening hook. The bomb never destroyed Robert Oppenheimer, and neither, in the end, did Lewis Strauss acting alone, or even the broader political paranoia of the era acting alone. What destroys him is the same hunger for singular recognition that built the bomb in the first place, now reflected back at him through a colleague who wanted that same recognition badly enough to take it from the one man standing in his way. The apple at Cambridge and the sentence in this hearing room are, structurally, the exact same act, an unbearable need to matter more than the person standing next to you, expressed once by a humiliated student and once, years later, by an ambitious physicist finally seizing his moment. And the film has been patiently, deliberately building the connection between these two moments since its very first scene. Do not rush past this moment the way a lesser adaptation of this story might. The comeback that follows later in this story, whatever limited public rehabilitation eventually arrives for Robert Oppenheimer, means nothing if the audience has not first been made to feel the full, suffocating weight of what collapses in this hearing room. Watch how Nolan holds on Cillian Murphy's face during Teller's testimony longer than the scene strictly requires for plot purposes, refusing to cut away to reaction shots from the panel, refusing to soften the moment with any kind of rescuing dialogue from his own legal team. There is no comeback line available to him here. There is no clever rebuttal that undoes what has just been said. For the first time in the entire film, the man who has always had the sharpest answer in any room has nothing left to say that could possibly repair the damage, and the silence that follows Teller's statement is, structurally, the loudest moment in the entire back half of the film, louder even than the detonation at Trinity, because this silence carries no ambiguity about triumph or horror inside it. It is simply, unambiguously, defeat. Weak treatments of this exact kind of moment tend to rush toward the comeback, eager to relieve the audience's discomfort as quickly as possible, offering a rousing rebuttal or a dignified exit line that restores some measure of the protagonist's composure before the scene ends. This film refuses that comfort almost entirely. Oppenheimer does not stand, does not object, does not deliver a closing statement that reasserts his dignity for the benefit of the room or the audience watching him. He simply absorbs the sentence, visibly, completely, and the hearing moves forward to its next procedural item as though nothing extraordinary has just happened, which is, in its own quiet way, the cruelest detail in the entire sequence. The machinery of the hearing does not pause to acknowledge what it has just done to this man. It simply continues, indifferent, because from the institution's perspective, nothing extraordinary has happened at all. Only another witness answering another routine question. And that institutional indifference to a moment the audience understands as devastating is exactly the gap the film wants you to feel most acutely in this scene. Some viewers, revisiting this moment, will feel that the film is finally, fully delivering justice, however painful. Watching a man who spent decades wielding his intelligence carelessly against everyone around him finally experience the same casual cruelty turned back on himself. Others will feel that the punishment here vastly exceeds the crime, that a flawed, arrogant, often thoughtless man is being destroyed for offenses far smaller than the ones the film has spent 7 acts documenting without institutional consequence. Both reactions are legitimate responses to what the film puts on screen, and the fact that a single scene can generate both a sense of overdue justice and a sense of genuine tragedy simultaneously is precisely what separates this film's approach to its protagonist from a simpler, more comfortable morality tale. Notice, too, how little dialogue the film actually allows Oppenheimer in the immediate aftermath of Teller's statement, a striking choice for a character who has, up to this point, always had something precise and cutting to say in nearly every room he has occupied. Silence, for this specific character, is not simply an absence of words. It is the clearest possible signal of total collapse, because a man defined for 8 full acts by his verbal command of every situation he enters has just been rendered, for the first time, genuinely speechless, and the film trusts its audience enough to let that silence do all of the emotional work rather than manufacturing a cathartic outburst that would feel, given everything established about this character, dishonest. What has Robert Oppenheimer actually lost in this moment, beneath the surface, beyond the literal clearance being stripped away? Not his freedom, not his family, not even, in any immediate sense, his physical safety or comfort. What he has lost is the specific, singular story he has told himself about who he is since he was a humiliated student at Cambridge, a man whose intelligence would always, eventually, be recognized as valuable enough to excuse whatever damage accompanied it. Teller's betrayal proves, in a single devastating sentence, that this story was never actually true, that brilliance alone never purchased the permanent belonging Oppenheimer assumed it had, that the same government and the same colleagues who once needed him badly enough to overlook a poisoned apple, a communist brother, a dishonest security statement, and an affair with a woman actively under surveillance, are now willing to discard him the instant his usefulness runs out. This is not merely professional humiliation. It is the total collapse of a psychological framework this entire film has spent 7 acts building, brick by brick, specifically so that its collapse, here, in this small, unglamorous room, would land with the full force of everything that came before it. This is also the moment worth revisiting the earlier open loop the film planted through Kitty's competence, consistently correct, consistently overruled, throughout every earlier act. Somewhere underneath the specific pain of Teller's betrayal is a quieter, more universal recognition finally forcing its way into Robert Oppenheimer's awareness that being right, being brilliant, being the most capable person in nearly every room he has ever occupied has never actually guaranteed the outcome he assumed it would. Kitty could have told him this decades ago, has effectively been telling him this in 100 smaller ways since Berkeley, and he never fully absorbed the lesson until it was delivered to him directly, at maximum cost, by a man whose own career he spent years indulging and protecting. The film does not need to state this parallel explicitly. It has spent 7 acts building the audience's capacity to recognize it without narration, and recognizing it now, in this exact moment of collapse, is precisely what elevates this scene from a plot beat about a security clearance into the emotional and thematic climax of the entire film. Would this collapse have carried the same weight if it had happened at Cambridge, when Oppenheimer was young and unproven, rather than here, at the absolute peak of his fame and public significance? Almost certainly not, and understanding why reveals the film's real subject more clearly than almost any other single question you could ask about it. A young man's early failure is expected, survivable, even instructive, easily reframed later as a formative struggle on the way to greatness. A famous man's public collapse, arriving after every possible external marker of success has already been achieved, offers no such comforting reframing available. There is no later chapter left to redeem this failure into a growth story, because the growth story, the one about a brilliant, flawed man finally maturing into wisdom and public service, is precisely the story this hearing room has just definitively ended. Notice that the film never lets Oppenheimer die in this story, never even lets him him face physical danger in any of these final acts. And yet this scene functions with nearly all the emotional weight of a death scene regardless. That is deliberate. The film is arguing, through its structure rather than its dialogue, that the death of a carefully maintained self-image can carry weight nearly equivalent to an actual death, especially for a man whose entire identity was constructed almost entirely out of how thoroughly other people needed and admired him. He leaves the hearing that day visibly diminished, and the film does not grant him a private breakdown scene. No tears, no dramatic confrontation with Teller afterward, only a quiet, hollowed stillness that is arguably more devastating than any louder reaction could have been. Kitty meets him outside, and for the first time in the entire film, we see something close to a genuine, wordless partnership between them, not because their marriage has suddenly healed, but because catastrophe has finally, briefly, put them on the exact same side of a fight for the first time since Los Alamos. Hold this fragile alignment in mind, because it sets up the single sharpest reversal still remaining in this story. The moment when the woman Robert Oppenheimer spent decades failing to fully see finally gets her one chance to be seen herself, in the one room where it will matter most. Notice, too, how the film slows down deliberately in the immediate aftermath, mirroring the exact same deceleration technique it used after Los Alamos was first assembled. After Trinity's celebration, a quiet, wordless stretch that gives the audience space to sit with the emotional weight of what just happened before the story moves forward again. There is no swelling score here, no dramatic monologue processing the betrayal out loud. Just two people standing outside a nondescript government building, having just watched a life's work and a life's self-conception collapse in the span of a single sentence. And the restraint of this moment is itself a form of respect the film extends to its own protagonist, refusing to turn his lowest point into spectacle even as it refuses to soften how completely, how permanently, this specific defeat has landed. Hold on to this image. Two figures standing quietly outside an unremarkable government building. As the closest thing this film offers to a genuine turning point in the marriage the story has been quietly tracking since Kitty first appeared. It has taken total professional annihilation, the complete destruction of everything Robert Oppenheimer built his identity around, to finally produce a moment where he needs her more visibly than he needs to be admired by anyone else in the room. It is a bitter, expensive way to arrive at partnership, and the film does not pretend otherwise, refusing to sentimentalize this moment into a tidy reconciliation. It simply lets you see, briefly, what this marriage might have looked like all along, had Robert Oppenheimer ever been capable of needing his wife before he had nothing left to offer her but need. Tell me in the comments whether you think this marriage could have survived and thrived if catastrophe had never forced this specific kind of vulnerability into it, or whether Robert Oppenheimer was simply constitutionally incapable of the sustained presence real partnership requires, regardless of circumstance. It is a question the film leaves genuinely open, and the answer likely says as much about how you understand human capacity for change as it does about this particular man and this particular marriage. What we know for certain is what happens next. The hearing is not yet finished. One witness remains who has not yet spoken, one voice the panel has not yet heard from, and it belongs to the person this entire film has spent 8 acts training you to underestimate. Kitty is finally called to testify, and the film has been quietly building toward this exact moment since the very first dinner party, where her sharpness sat and used at a table full of men too self-absorbed to ask her a serious question. Rob approaches her the way he approached her husband, aggressive, prepared, clearly expecting the same disorientation and stammering contradiction he successfully extracted from Robert days earlier. He does not get it. Kitty answers every hostile question with a precision that feels less like defense and more like counterattack, recalling names, dates, and specific political affiliations from decades earlier with an accuracy that visibly unsettles a prosecutor accustomed to witnesses fumbling under this exact kind of pressure. Watch how differently Emily Blunt plays this scene compared to every earlier moment of quiet domestic frustration the film has given her. There is no hesitation here, no deference, no trace of the exhausted, sidelined wife from the Los Alamos years. This is a woman who has spent decades being underestimated, finally given a stage where her actual capability cannot be dismissed, reframed, or talked over by anyone in the room. There is a specific satisfaction in this scene that the film has earned through patient, deliberate craft rather than cheap wish fulfillment, and it is worth naming why that distinction matters. A lesser film would have given Kitty this moment of vindication as a surprise, a twist revealing hidden depths the audience never suspected. This film gives us no surprise at all, because we have watched Kitty be right, repeatedly, specifically, provably right, since the very first act, at Berkeley dinner parties, in her assessment of Los Alamos security risks, in her private counsel about how to handle this very hearing. The satisfaction here comes precisely from confirmation rather than revelation. The audience finally watching a competence we already fully believed and received the stage it was always capable of commanding, if anyone in her life had simply been willing to offer it to her sooner. There is also a specific craft observation worth making about how the film blocks this scene physically. Kitty sits upright, still, hands folded, occupying noticeably less nervous physical space than her husband did during his own testimony days earlier, and that composure is itself a form of quiet rebuke, communicated entirely through posture rather than dialogue. Where Robert visibly shrank under Rob's questioning, hunched, hesitant, reaching for words that would not fully cooperate, Kitty remains almost unervingly still, and that stillness signals something the film has been building toward across the entire back half of the story. This is a woman who has spent years being systematically underestimated by the men in her orbit, and she has used that underestimation, whether consciously or not, as camouflage, allowing her actual capacity for precision and control to remain invisible until the exact moment it becomes most useful to reveal it fully. Ask yourself how many women in comparable positions throughout history have deployed exactly this same strategy, cultivating an appearance of manageable domesticity precisely because the alternative, being recognized too early as genuinely formidable, would have invited a different, more direct kind of resistance from the men around them. The film does not need to make this argument explicitly through dialogue, because Emily Blunt's performance carries it entirely through the accumulated weight of every earlier scene. The drinking, the isolation, the sharp asides at dinner parties nobody else in the room seem to fully register as warnings rather than simply commentary, all of it retroactively reading, in this moment, as a kind of dormant capability finally activated by necessity rather than choice. There is a specific piece of film criticism worth applying to the editing of this scene as well, because the cuts here are noticeably longer and less frequent than the frantic, urgent editing rhythm of the Los Alamos years or the disorienting fragmentation of Robert's own testimony days earlier. The camera holds on Kitty's face, lets her answers breathe fully before cutting away, granting her a visual authority the editing itself withholds from nearly every other witness in this hearing. And that formal choice is doing quiet, deliberate work, communicating the film's respect for this particular testimony through pacing alone, without ever needing a single line of dialogue to state it directly. Rob attempts one particular line of attack that backfires with real dramatic force, pressing Kitty on why, if she had genuinely broken from communist politics as thoroughly as she claims, she never formally renounced her earlier party membership in writing. Kitty's response is immediate, calm, and devastating. An ordinary conversation could not exist inside 1954 America, she says. This is not simply a clever rejoinder. It condenses, in one sentence, everything the film has spent this entire final act trying to establish about the nature of the hearing itself, that the entire proceeding conflates decades-old political sympathy, common enough among an entire generation of engaged intellectuals during the Depression and the Spanish Civil War, with active, ongoing disloyalty, and that the distinction, obvious to anyone actually reasoning in good faith, has been deliberately blurred throughout these proceedings. For political convenience, Rob has no effective response. For the only time in the entire hearing, the prosecution's carefully constructed momentum stalls completely, and the film lets the silence following her answer breathe for a beat longer than comfortable, allowing the audience to feel exactly how rare and how satisfying this specific reversal actually is. Compare this exchange to every earlier scene in the film where Kitty's insight was met with silence, distraction, or gentle dismissal by the men around her, and the contrast becomes almost unbearable in its precision. For the first time in this entire story, someone in a position of institutional power is forced to actually reckon with what she says rather than simply moving past it, and the film lets that reckoning play out with the same clean, decisive dramatic logic it gave Oppenheimer's own moments of triumph earlier in the story. A Berkeley lecture hall, a Trinity detonation, a Truman meeting where his brilliance was, for a brief window, unquestioned. Kitty receives exactly one such moment across the entire film, here, in a hostile hearing room, testifying to save her husband's career rather than advance her own, and the film wants you to feel the injustice embedded in that asymmetry as clearly as it wants you to feel the satisfaction of her actually winning the exchange. Consider, too, the specific irony embedded in what Kitty is actually defending in this room. She is not defending her own reputation, her own career, her own place in history. She is defending a man who spent decades failing to fully see her, using precisely the intellectual sharpness kindness that same man consistently overlooked, ignored, or simply failed to draw upon when it might have benefited them both. This is not an act of naive devotion. The film gives her too much clear-eyed intelligence throughout the story for that reading to hold. It is closer to a pragmatic recognition that her own future, her children's future, and whatever remains of the life she has built are all still bound up in this man's survival, regardless of how completely he failed to reciprocate her competence across every earlier act of their marriage. And she testifies with the same unsentimental precision she has always brought to problems the men around her were too self-absorbed to solve correctly on their own. There is a rhetorical question worth putting directly to the audience here. Does love require reciprocity to be genuine, or can a person love someone imperfectly, incompletely, while still showing up decisively in the moment that matters most? Kitty's testimony does not undo years of neglect, does not retroactively transform an unequal marriage into an equal one, and the film refuses to let this scene function as easy redemption for either of them. What it offers instead is something more honest and considerably more complicated, a portrait of loyalty that survives despite disappointment rather than because disappointment was ever resolved, a loyalty that looks, from certain angles, like genuine love, and from others, like a woman doing what she has always done, managing a crisis her husband's own choices helped create, because managing crises has become, over the course of this marriage, simply who she is. It is worth returning here to the film's earlier thesis about Kitty's competence, established across half a dozen scenes throughout the story and consistently ignored by the one person best positioned to actually benefit from it. This testimony is not a sudden transformation. It is not a character discovering hidden strength she never previously possessed. It is the same sharp, strategic mind the audience has watched operate correctly and be overruled since her very first appearance, now finally given a venue where her husband's ego cannot interfere with the outcome. There is something almost unbearably ironic in the fact that Robert Oppenheimer's best possible defense, the single most effective witness in this entire hearing, was available to him this entire time, sitting across from him at breakfast every single morning for over a decade, and he never once needed a security clearance hearing to access her insight. He simply needed to ask. There is a moral dilemma worth sitting with here, rather than passing over quickly. Does this single scene redeem the marriage retroactively, recasting years of neglect as simply the unfortunate byproduct of a brilliant, distracted man who genuinely loved his wife even while consistently failing her? Or does it instead sharpen the tragedy, proving definitively that the capability was always there, fully available, and that every earlier failure to draw on it was not an accident of circumstance, but a choice, repeated over and over, by a man who could not bring himself to treat his wife as a full partner until total professional catastrophe left him no other option? The film does not resolve this question for you, and it should not, because both readings coexist honestly inside the same marriage, inside the same scene, inside the same complicated, unresolved feeling the ending of this story is about to ask you to sit with. Some viewers will find real hope in this scene, evidence that even deeply flawed marriages contain the possibility of genuine mutual respect when circumstances finally force it into existence. Others will find it almost unbearably sad, watching a woman finally receive recognition for a competence that could have made both their lives immeasurably better had it been welcomed a decade earlier, arriving instead only when there is nothing left to save but damage control. The film does not ask you to choose between these readings. It asks you to hold the tenderness and the tragedy in the same hand, which is, in miniature, exactly what it has been asking you to do with Robert Oppenheimer himself since the very first frame of the movie. Compare this dual reading to how the film has treated its protagonist throughout, a man capable of genuine moral seriousness and genuine self-serving vanity in the same breath, capable of building the most destructive weapon in human history while also genuinely, if belatedly, opposing the next escalation of that same destructive logic. The marriage functions as a smaller scale version of the same argument, capable of real neglect and, in its final act, real partnership, without either quality canceling out the other or requiring the film to declare a final, simplified verdict on which one defines the relationship more truly. This refusal to simplify is, by this point in the story, the single most consistent formal choice the film makes across every relationship, every character, and every historical judgment it asks you to weigh. Tell me in the comments which reading feels truer to you by the end of this film: a marriage genuinely redeemed by crisis, or a partnership whose fundamental imbalance was simply exposed, one final time, by circumstances neither person could fully control. There is no wrong answer here, only the answer that reflects how much grace you are willing to extend to a man the film has spent 9 acts refusing refusing to let you judge simply in either direction. Despite Kitty's testimony, despite the procedural unfairness the film has documented throughout, the panel votes, predictably, to revoke Robert Oppenheimer's security clearance, citing his past associations and, more pointedly, his continued opposition to the hydrogen bomb as evidence of questionable judgment rather than genuine conviction. The verdict itself is almost anticlimactic in how the film presents it. A formal letter, a quiet announcement. None of the dramatic courtroom flourish a more conventional film might have staged for this moment, and that restraint is deliberate. Justice, or the absence of it, in this story does not arrive with thunder. It arrives through paperwork, through bureaucratic language stripped of any acknowledgement of the human cost it represents, the exact same institutional indifference the film has been tracking since Groves first recruited Oppenheimer under a bargain that was always going to expire eventually. Notice specifically how the film frames his continued opposition to the hydrogen bomb as a formal count against him, because this detail deserves more attention than a single sentence in the verdict typically receives. This was not new evidence of disloyalty. It was a documented policy disagreement, made in good faith, through entirely appropriate institutional channels, by a man exercising exactly the kind of independent scientific judgment his position was created to provide. Punishing that judgment as evidence of untrustworthiness sets a precedent the film wants you to recognize as chilling well beyond this single case. An entire generation of scientists and policy advisors watching this verdict would understand, correctly, that voicing genuine disagreement with military escalation could now cost them their careers, regardless of whether that disagreement was substantively correct. Compare this outcome to the Szilard petition from much earlier in the film, another instance of a scientist raising a formal, good-faith moral or strategic objection that the government ultimately chose to override or punish rather than seriously engage with on its merits. The pattern recurring here, at the very end of the story, is not a coincidence. It is the film's closing argument about how institutional power actually treats conscience when conscience becomes inconvenient, not through open suppression, which would be too visible and too easily criticized, but through slower, procedurally legitimate mechanisms, committee votes, security reviews, formal letters, each individually defensible, that accomplish the exact same silencing effect while allowing everyone involved to maintain the comfortable fiction that due process, rather than raw institutional convenience, determine the outcome. At what point does a democracy's legitimate interest in security become indistinguishable from simple intolerance for dissent it finds inconvenient? This is not a question this film answers with a tidy formula, and it should not be, because the honest answer likely shifts depending on the specific stakes, the specific era, and the specific balance of power between the person raising an objection and the institution being asked to hear it. What the film insists on, unambiguously, is that in this specific case, at this specific historical moment, the balance tipped decisively away from genuine reckoning with Oppenheimer's argument and towards simple, efficient removal of an inconvenient voice. The film's restraint in refusing to editorialize this verdict with an outraged narrator's voice or a swelling, indignant score is itself part of its argument. Injustice delivered calmly, through proper channels, stamped and filed and mailed, is not less unjust for arriving quietly. It may, in fact, be more insidious, precisely because its bureaucratic packaging makes it so much easier for everyone involved, and for history itself, to look away from. Robert Oppenheimer's career as a government insider effectively ends here, stripped of the access and influence that defined his entire post-war identity, reduced from presidential advisor to a private citizen whose opinions on nuclear policy the country he served no longer has any formal obligation to hear. Hold this ending in mind alongside everything that built toward it: the poisoned apple, the Berkeley Lecture Hall, Trinity, Hiroshima, the isotope hearing, Teller's betrayal, because the final act of this story is not actually finished yet. There is one more reversal still to come, one more room where the balance of power shifts entirely, and it does not belong to Robert Oppenheimer at all. It belongs to the man who spent this entire story believing he had finally won. Ask yourself, before we move into that final reversal, whether you believe Robert Oppenheimer's downfall was ultimately just, deserved in proportion to whatever culpability he genuinely carries, or whether it represents a miscarriage of the very institutions meant to distinguish between reasonable dissent and actual disloyalty. The film has given you enough evidence to argue either position seriously, and it is worth having that argument with yourself honestly before it hands you the last piece of the puzzle, the one that reframes not Oppenheimer's guilt or innocence, but the true nature of the man who spent a decade patiently ensuring this exact outcome. Consider, too, how the film has been quietly withholding a piece of information from you throughout this entire hearing, saving it deliberately for the very end of the story rather than the middle of it. Everything we have watched in this act, Kitty's testimony, Teller's betrayal, the panel's verdict, has occurred entirely inside Oppenheimer's own subjective color timeline, filtered through his own memory and understanding of events as they happened to him. The black and white Strauss timeline, running in parallel throughout the entire film, has been building towards something the audience has not yet been shown in full, a separate hearing, years later, that will finally explain exactly how much of what just happened to Oppenheimer was engineered, and by whom, and why. Hold every piece of this act in your memory as we move toward that final reversal, Kitty's unexpected command of the room, the verdict's quiet, bureaucratic cruelty, the hydrogen bomb descent used against him, because none of it will read the same way once you understand the fuller context the film has been withholding. This is the final open loop of the entire story, planted deliberately, and its closing will not simply satisfy curiosity about a plot detail. It will recontextualize the entire moral weight of everything you have watched so far, forcing a final, uncomfortable reassessment of exactly who deserves to be remembered as the villain of this story, and exactly what price both men ultimately paid for needing, more than anything else, to never again feel small in a room. We are almost there. One room remains, one final reversal, and it belongs entirely to the man who believed, walking out of Robert Oppenheimer's ruined hearing, that he had finally won everything he ever wanted.